The silk ribbon was the wrong shade. That was all it took. Seraphine Hartwell stood in the center of the grand entrance hall of her father's estate, holding the offending ribbon between two fingers, as though it were something unpleasant she had found on the floor. The seamstress, a small woman named Clara Finch, stood 3 feet away with her hands clasped in front of her. She had spent 4 days on the dress. 4 days cutting, stitching, adjusting, and pressing. The gown was extraordinary by any measure. Layered ivory silk that moved like water, with delicate beadwork along the bodice that had taken her an entire evening to complete. But the ribbon at the collar was a pale blush instead of the soft champagne Seraphine had specified, and that was enough. Clara watched as Seraphine dropped the ribbon onto the marble floor. "Take it back," Seraphine said. Clara blinked. "My lady." The fabric shop had run out of the exact shade. "I selected the nearest match. If you look closely, the difference is barely—" "I did not ask for your explanation," Seraphine said. "I asked for champagne. You brought blush. These are not the same color." "The ball is in 4 hours," Clara said quietly. "Then, you have 4 hours." There was a long pause. Everyone in the entrance hall, the housekeeper, the footman near the door, 2 of the upstairs maids who had frozen on the staircase, went very still. They all knew what happened when someone pushed back, even gently. They had all learned, over time, that it was far easier to simply give Seraphine whatever she wanted than to explain why it could not be done. Clara did not push back. She picked up the ribbon, nodded once, and walked out of the house. No one said anything. Seraphine turned and walked back toward the upper corridor, her footsteps unhurried. She paused at the foot of the stairs and looked at the 2 maids who had been watching. They immediately looked away and began moving as though they had always been in the middle of some task. She continued upstairs. In her dressing room, she sat at the mirror and examined her reflection with the focused attention of someone conducting an inspection. Her dark hair was arranged in a style she had chosen herself that morning, overruling the suggestion of her lady's maid, who had wanted something softer. Seraphine preferred the version that sat high and precise. It looked like authority. She had always known, from a very young age, that how a person looked in a room determined how that room responded to them. She had used that knowledge every single day of her life. She was 24 years old. She had never been told no. Not by her tutors, who had learned quickly that disagreement made their days long and unpleasant. Not by the young men who had courted her, who spent their entire visits agreeing with everything she said, in the hope that agreement would bring them closer to marrying into the Hartwell name. Not by the various household staff, who came and went with a frequency that had less to do with poor service and more to do with the particular difficulty of working for someone who expected perfection and did not distinguish between a genuine mistake and an unavoidable one. Not even by her father. George Hartwell, the Duke of Ashmore, was a man of considerable power. He sat in the House of Lords. He owned 4 estates across 3 counties. His name opened doors that remained firmly closed to other men of equal or greater wealth, because the Hartwell name carried something that money alone could not manufacture: generations of standing, of carefully arranged marriages, of favors given and debts quietly collected. George Hartwell was not a man who was easily refused anything either. But when it came to Seraphine, his one daughter, born after 2 sons who had died in infancy, George Hartwell had made a decision early and had never reconsidered it. She would not know disappointment. He had told himself it was love. Perhaps it was. But it had a shape more like fear, the fear of a man who had lost 2 children before they could speak, and who had looked at this surviving daughter and decided, with the terrible certainty of grief, that she would be protected from every difficulty the world could offer. If she wanted something, she received it. If someone displeased her, that person was removed. If she expressed a preference, the household rearranged itself around that preference without question. The result, after 24 years, was a young woman who had never learned that other people had needs of their own. She was not cruel in the way that people are cruel when they intend to cause harm. She was something more complicated than that. She was simply someone who had never been required to consider anyone else, and so she did not. When she dismissed Clara Finch over a ribbon, she was not thinking about the 4 days of work or the walk back through town in the cold. She was thinking about her collar. That was all. The ball that evening was held at Hartwell Manor for a charitable organization that George Hartwell patronized, a hospital foundation, which provided beds and doctors to those who could not afford either. It was the kind of event that allowed wealthy families to feel generous, while also enjoying an excellent orchestra and 3 courses of very good food. The guest list was long. People came from across the county, and several from London. The house blazed with light from every window, and the sound of conversation and music drifted out across the dark lawns. Clara had returned with a new ribbon, in the correct shade, with 40 minutes to spare. She had not said anything when she delivered it. Seraphine had not thanked her. By 8 in the evening, the entrance hall and the 2 reception rooms were full of precisely the kind of people Seraphine was accustomed to. Men with titles, women in gowns that were almost as fine as her own, and the particular variety of social performance that accompanied any gathering where everyone present knew exactly who outranked whom. Seraphine moved through the rooms with the ease of someone who had been doing this since childhood. She knew how to nod at the right people and look past the ones who were not worth her time. She knew how to position herself in a room so that people came to her rather than the other way around. She knew how to make someone feel chosen simply by speaking to them, and how to make someone feel invisible simply by not. She was, by any social measure, exceptional at all of it. Her father stood near the far end of the reception room, with 2 other men, deep in some conversation that involved a great deal of nodding. He caught her eye briefly across the room and smiled, the particular smile he reserved for moments when she looked exactly as he wanted her to look. She gave him the smallest possible acknowledgement in return, and turned away. She was not in the mood for her father's approval tonight. She was in the mood to be exactly where she was, the most important person in any room she entered. By 9 o'clock she had completed the necessary circuit of introductions and conversations, had received 3 compliments on her gown that she accepted without expression, and had positioned herself near the entrance to the library, where the more interesting conversations tended to happen. The library adjoined the reception room through a wide archway, and a number of the guests had drifted in. People who were less interested in dancing and more interested in talking. Seraphine preferred talkers. They were easier to read. It was there, in the library, standing near the fireplace with a glass of champagne she had barely touched, that she first noticed the man in the corner. He was not remarkable to look at. Dark hair, simply cut. A well-made jacket, but not a fashionable one. The jacket of a man who had chosen it for fit rather than impression. He was seated at a small writing desk that had been pushed to the corner of the room to make space, and he had a book open on his knee, which in itself was not so unusual. What was unusual was that he appeared to actually be reading it, not pretending to read while watching the room, not holding it open while looking for someone to speak to. Reading. Seraphine noticed him the way she noticed anything out of place, with mild, clinical interest. She was not used to people ignoring a room she was in. She did not analyze this particular response in herself. She simply registered the anomaly and filed it for later. A woman appeared beside her, her aunt, Charlotte Hartwell, who was her father's younger sister, and who was the kind of person who introduced everyone to everyone else, with enormous enthusiasm, and very little concern for whether the introduction was wanted. "Seraphine," Charlotte said brightly, touching her arm. "Have you met Dr. Calloway? He's been doing wonderful work with the hospital foundation. I invited him especially. He doesn't come to many of these things, so it's quite a treat to have him." Seraphine followed her aunt's gaze toward the corner. "The one reading?" Seraphine said. "Yes. Isn't that charming? He says parties exhaust him. I told him he is perfectly welcome to sit in the corner with a book as long as he came." Charlotte laughed softly to herself. "His name is Edmund Calloway. He's a physician. Quite brilliant, apparently. He set up a clinic on Millbank Road, the sort of place where people who cannot afford a doctor can still see one. He's not from a family you would know." That last part was delivered without any particular judgment. Charlotte Hartwell was not a snob, which was one of the reasons Seraphine found her slightly bewildering. Seraphine said. She looked at Edmund Calloway for another moment. He turned a page. He did not look up. Seraphine moved on. The evening continued at its usual pace. The orchestra played. A young baronet named Philip Graves attempted to engage Seraphine in a conversation about fox hunting that she ended after 90 seconds by simply walking away mid-sentence. He did not follow, because he had heard enough about Seraphine Hartwell to know better. A woman named Louise Pemberton, whose husband handled some of the Duke's legal affairs, tried to compliment Seraphine's dress in such an extended and elaborate fashion that it began to feel less like a compliment and more like a plea for something. Seraphine accepted it with the flat graciousness she used when she could not be bothered to perform warmth, and moved on. At 9:30, she wanted somewhere quieter for a few minutes. She returned to the library, which had thinned out. The music was softer here, filtered through the stone walls. Two elderly gentlemen had settled into armchairs near the window and were talking in low voices. A young woman in blue was examining the spines of books on the far shelf, with the careful attention of someone who was genuinely curious about them, rather than simply looking for something to do with her hands. And in the corner, Edmund Calloway was still reading. Seraphine looked at the chair nearest to him. It was a good chair, high-backed, set close to the smaller fireplace in the corner of the library. She had sat in it many times at previous events. It was her preferred seat in this room. She crossed the library with unhurried steps and stopped in front of him. He did not look up immediately. He finished the sentence he was reading. Then he looked up. His eyes were dark and attentive. He looked at her without the particular expression most people wore when they looked at Seraphine. The slight anxiety, the eagerness to please, the readiness to accommodate. He looked at her the way someone looks at a stranger they have not yet formed an opinion of. "That is my chair," Seraphine said. It was a simple statement. She said it the way she said most things, not as a request, not as an explanation, but as information, that she expected to be acted upon immediately. He looked at the chair, then back at her. "I don't see a name on it," he said pleasantly. Seraphine blinked. The two words registered in her brain. But for a moment, they did not arrange themselves into anything she could respond to. In all of her 24 years, across every social situation, and every request she had made, she had never received that particular answer. She had received apologies. She had received excuses. She had received immediate compliance. And occasionally, she had received elaborate explanations for why something could not be done, exactly as she wanted. She had never, in any context, received casual, cheerful disagreement from a stranger who was still looking at her with an expression of complete calm. "This is my father's house," she said. "I'm sure it is," he said. "And it's a very fine house." He glanced around the library with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "Excellent collection, too. I've been looking at the titles on the lower shelves. Whoever built this library had very good taste." He looked back at her. "If you need somewhere to sit, I'm happy to help pull another chair over. There are several along that wall." He said this without irony and without challenge. He was simply offering a practical solution. Seraphine stood very still. The two elderly gentlemen near the window had stopped talking. The young woman in blue had turned slightly from the bookshelf. Not enough to be obvious, but enough. The footman positioned near the library entrance had gone very rigid. They were all waiting. Seraphine became aware, in that moment, of a sensation she did not have a name for. It was not anger exactly, though it lived close to anger. It was something stranger, something closer to the feeling of reaching for a door handle and finding the door is not there. The absence of something she had never noticed before, because it had always been present. She said nothing. She turned and walked out of the library. She did not look back. She crossed the reception room at a pace that was still unhurried, still controlled, because Seraphine Hartwell did not allow her face or her pace to tell anyone what she was feeling. She took a glass of fresh champagne from a passing tray and stood near the tall windows at the far end of the room, looking out at the dark garden. Her heart was doing something unusual. She pressed her fingertips against the cool glass of the window and breathed through it slowly. Around her, the party continued. The music played. People laughed. Her father was shaking hands with someone across the room. She replayed the moment in the library, which she could not seem to stop doing. She replayed the way he had looked at the chair and back at her, without any sign of nervousness. She replayed the tone of his voice. Not rude, not confrontational, simply unimpressed. She replayed the offer to pull another chair over, which had been entirely genuine, and which made the whole thing worse somehow, because it meant he had not been dismissing her. He had simply not moved for her. There was a difference. She was only beginning to understand what that difference was. Across the room, she could see her Aunt Charlotte talking animatedly with a group near the fireplace. Charlotte caught her eye and gave her a warm smile. Seraphine gave the smile back on instinct, the perfectly measured social version, the one that gave nothing away. She spent the rest of the evening performing the role she always performed. Gracious where required, cool where preferred. the gravitational center of every conversation she chose to enter. From the outside, nothing had changed. She was Seraphine Hartwell. She was exactly as she always was. But somewhere in the back of her mind, in the particular silence that follows something unexpected, a question had opened up. It was not a loud question. It was a quiet one, almost imperceptible, like a crack in a wall that is still so thin you have to press your face close to see it. It simply asked, "Why did that bother you so much?" She had no answer for it yet. She arrived home after midnight, dismissed her lady's maid, sat at the dressing table, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Clara Finch had worked for 4 days on that gown. She had walked back into town in the cold for a ribbon. She had returned with 40 minutes to spare, and had not said a word about any of it. Seraphine had not thought about Clara once since the ribbon arrived. She thought about her now. She sat with that thought for a moment, turning it over, not entirely sure what to do with it. Then, she blew out the candle and went to bed. She slept well, which she always did. But in the morning, before she was fully awake, the question was still there. It had not gone anywhere. It would not. Edmund Calloway woke before the rest of the city did. He had always been this way, even as a boy growing up in his father's small house near the river in Norwich, where the mornings smelled of damp wood and bread from the bakehouse 2 streets over. He woke before dawn, dressed quietly, made tea in the small kitchen of the flat above his clinic on Millbank Road, and sat at the table near the window with a notebook open in front of him. He wrote down the things he needed to do that day, in the order that made the most logical sense. It was a habit he had developed during his years of training, when the volume of information he needed to retain was large enough that forgetting any of it could mean harming someone. He had kept the habit long after training was over, long after forgetting had become less dangerous, because it helped him see the shape of the day before it arrived. Today the list included a follow-up with a woman on King Street whose breathing had improved over the past 2 weeks, a consultation with a boy whose mother had brought him in 3 times for the same persistent cough, a visit to the hospital foundation to review the accounts for the new ward they were hoping to open in the spring, and a note he needed to write to a colleague in Edinburgh about a treatment approach he had been reading about. He read back over the list, added 2 items he had forgotten, and finished his tea. The clinic opened at 8. By 9 it was full. This was not unusual. Millbank Road was not a prosperous address. The people who came to Edmund's clinic came because they had nowhere else to go, or because they had been to the hospital and been told to wait, or because they could not afford to wait. They came with children who coughed, with hands that had been injured at work, with ailments that had gone untreated for so long that they had become ordinary features of daily life, rather than conditions that could be addressed. Edmund treated all of them with the same attention and the same patience, regardless of how long they had waited, or how minor or serious the problem was. His assistant, a steady young man named Oliver Grant, who had grown up in the same ward and had come to work at the clinic after finishing his own basic training, moved people through the small waiting room with quiet efficiency. Edmund did not think about the ball at Hartwell Manor until nearly noon, when Oliver mentioned it in passing while handing him a file. "How was the event last evening?" Oliver asked. "The Duke's Foundation thing?" "Fine," Edmund said. "Good library." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "You read at a party?" "Most of the party," Edmund confirmed, reviewing the file. Oliver made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. "Did you speak to anyone?" "Briefly." Edmund paused at a notation in the file. "Is this figure from last month or the month before?" "Last month. Why briefly?" "Someone wanted my chair. I offered to help find her another one. She left." He handed the file back. "What is this notation referring to?" Oliver looked at it. "The medication costs in October. They went up." "How much?" "Enough to matter." Edmund nodded and made a note in his own book. The chair incident had occupied approximately 30 seconds of his evening, and had not occupied his mind since. He had genuinely not thought about it after the woman left the library. He had returned to his book, finished the chapter, and then had a very good conversation with one of the hospital administrators about drainage systems in the new ward, which was a more interesting topic than it sounded. He had not registered who she was. Her name had not come up. He had simply seen someone who assumed a seat was hers because she wanted it to be, told her pleasantly that it wasn't, and offered a reasonable alternative. That she had walked away without taking the offer was her own choice. He had not considered it further. This was, in its own way, the thing about Edmund Calloway that made him unusual. He had been raised by parents who had very little, and had worked hard, and had operated under the persistent understanding that the world did not owe you anything, that what you got, you earned, and what you earned, you valued. His father had been a schoolmaster. His mother had managed their household with the kind of careful precision that stretched every penny without making the poverty visible to the children. They had told him he was capable, which was different. Special implied the world would arrange itself around you. Capable implied you would figure out how to arrange yourself around the world. Edmund had taken that lesson seriously. He had been the kind of student who worked harder than everyone else, not because he was more talented, but because he refused to let anyone work harder than him. He had won his place at medical school on merit, had paid for it through a combination of scholarship and extraordinary debt, and had qualified near the top of his year. He had been offered a position at one of the more prestigious hospitals in London, which would have meant a good salary and a reasonable reputation, and the kind of steady professional advancement that most men in his position would have been grateful for. He had opened the clinic on Millbank Road instead. His mother had not understood this. His father had, quietly, without saying so directly. The people who could already afford doctors had plenty of doctors. The people who couldn't had Edmund. It was not a sentimental decision. It was a logical one. He had been running the clinic for 3 years. He knew most of his patients by name and by condition, and by the particular way that poverty shaped both. He knew which families would not come in until things were very bad, because they were afraid of what it would cost. He knew which children were growing well, and which were not. He knew which men came in with injuries from their work at the docks, and which came in with injuries from other circumstances they described in vague terms. He treated all of them, and did not comment on the descriptions. On the afternoon of the day after the ball, he received a letter. It arrived by private messenger, which was unusual. Most of his correspondence arrived through the ordinary post. The envelope was heavy cream paper with a monogrammed seal, and the handwriting on the front was precise and controlled. Oliver brought it in and set it on the desk with an expression of mild curiosity. Edmund opened it. It was from the Hartwell estate. Specifically, it was from someone identifying themselves as the Duke's personal secretary, informing Dr. Calloway that the Duke had become aware of an incident at the previous evening's event involving Dr. Calloway and Lady Seraphine, and that a formal apology was expected. Edmund read it twice. He read it a second time not because he did not understand it, but because he wanted to make sure he had not missed something that changed its meaning. He had not. The letter was exactly what it appeared to be, a request, dressed in the formal language of command, that he apologize to the Duke's daughter for not giving her his chair. He set the letter down on the desk and sat back. Oliver, who was pretending to organize papers near the window, said, "Good news or bad?" "Neither," Edmund said. "Interesting. What does it say?" Edmund considered how to summarize it. Someone expects an apology from me for something that does not require one. From the Hartwell estate? Oliver had seen the seal. Yes. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the Duke's family. George Hartwell. He has a lot of friends in useful places." "I know who he is," Edmund said. "And?" Edmund picked up his pen and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him. "And I'll reply politely." He wrote a brief, courteous response, acknowledging the letter, noting that he had thoroughly enjoyed the event, and found the work of the Hospital Foundation very worthwhile, and clarifying that he did not believe an apology was warranted, as no offense had been intended or committed, but that he hoped Lady Seraphine was well. He signed it, folded it, and handed it to Oliver, to send back with the same messenger who was waiting in the hallway. Then he returned to his work. Oliver stood in the doorway for a moment. "You know this might cause problems." "It might," Edmund agreed, without looking up. "The Duke is one of the Foundation's main patrons." "I'm aware. So if he decides he doesn't like you—" "Oliver," Edmund said, finally looking up. "If I spent my time worrying about whether powerful people liked me, I would have very little time left for anything useful. What is the next appointment?" Oliver looked at the book, Mrs. Holt on King Street. Follow-up. "Right," Edmund said. He stood. "Let's not keep her waiting." The matter, as far as Edmund was concerned, was handled. He had no idea that 2 streets away from the clinic, inside a hired carriage that had been circling the area for the better part of 20 minutes, Lady Seraphine Hartwell was watching the front door of the building with an expression on her face that no one who knew her would have recognized. She had read her father's secretary's letter before it was sent. She had not ordered it herself. That had been her father's doing, who had learned of the incident through the housekeeper, who had heard it from the footman at the library door. Her father had been quietly furious, in the particular way he was furious when someone failed to respect the family name, which in his understanding was the same as failing to respect Seraphine. Seraphine had not told him to send the letter. But she had not told him not to. She had read the response that came back before the day was out, because the secretary brought all correspondence directly to her father, and she had been in the room. She had read it over her father's shoulder while he frowned at it, the polite, utterly unbothered reply from Edmund Calloway that offered nothing she had been sent to retrieve. Her father had made a noise of displeasure and said something about the impertinence of self-made men who had no idea how society functioned. Seraphine had said nothing. Now she sat in the carriage outside his clinic and looked at the building. It was an unremarkable building, clean, well-maintained, with a small painted sign above the door that said simply, "Clinic." The waiting area inside was visible through the window from this angle, and it was full of people, a woman with a child on her knee, an elderly man, a young woman with her arm in a makeshift sling. She watched Edmund emerge from a back room to speak to the woman with the child. She could not hear what was said. She could see only his posture, his expressions, the way he crouched slightly to be at the same level as the child, who could not have been more than 5 years old, the way the child's mother's shoulders relaxed when he spoke to her. Seraphine watched this for a moment longer than she intended to. Then she told the driver to go, and she sat back against the seat, and she looked at her hands in her lap, and she tried to name what she was feeling. It was not anger anymore. She had arrived at anger yesterday, and had left it behind sometime in the night. It was something else now, something that did not have a clear shape yet. She had the uncomfortable feeling that she was standing at the beginning of a very long road, looking at it for the first time, and that everything she had been carrying with her up until this point was too heavy to carry to the end of it. She did not stop at the clinic that day, but she noted the address. He had not, in those first years at the clinic, anticipated how much of the work would have nothing to do with medicine in the technical sense. He had trained to understand bodies, how they worked, and what went wrong with them, and how to address what went wrong with the tools available. He had not been trained in the particular patience required to wait for someone to trust you enough to tell you what was actually wrong, which was different from what they said was wrong when they first came in. He had learned this lesson early, in the first weeks on Millbank Road, when a man named Arthur Cole had come in 3 times with what he described as a persistent headache. Edmund had examined him each time, found nothing that explained a headache of that duration, and had begun to sense, by the 3rd visit, that the headache was not the only thing Arthur Cole was carrying. On the 3rd visit he had asked, not about the headache, but about how Arthur was sleeping. The question had opened something. Arthur had talked for 20 minutes about a situation at home that was producing the kind of sustained, formless anxiety that lived in the body before it found a name in the mind. Edmund had not resolved the situation. He had no tools for that, but he had listened, and he had referred Arthur to a colleague who did have tools for it, and Arthur had eventually come back to the clinic, not for the headache, which had largely resolved, but to say that the referral had helped. Edmund thought about that often. The gap between what people presented and what they actually needed was frequently significant. It required attention and patience and the willingness to sit with someone in their uncertainty without rushing to fill the silence with a diagnosis. Oliver had this quality naturally, which was one of the reasons Edmund had kept him from the first week. He knew when to be quiet and when to speak, and which patients needed more time in the waiting room before they were ready to go through to the office. These were not skills from training. They were something else, the result of growing up in a place where people managed difficult things daily and learned to read each other out of necessity. Edmund had grown up somewhere similar. That similarity was one of the things that made Millbank Road feel right to him, in a way that the hospital would not have. He understood the people who came through his door, not because he had studied their circumstances, but because he had lived close enough to similar ones to know what they required. What they required, more than anything, was to be taken seriously. This was, he had discovered, both simpler and harder than it sounded. Simpler because it required no particular expertise beyond attention. Harder because attention was the one thing most people were too busy, or too tired, or too preoccupied with their own concerns to give consistently and honestly. Edmund gave it consistently. It was the thing he was most careful about, more careful than about any diagnostic decision, because a missed diagnosis could often be corrected, and attention, once withheld, was harder to offer convincingly afterward. He thought about this on the afternoon that Oliver told him the Hartwell response letter had been delivered, watching a woman settle her child on her knee in the waiting room, with the practiced ease of someone for whom this was part of every day. She did not know she was being watched. She was simply present, entirely, without performance, in the way that people are when they are not thinking about being observed, but are simply doing what they do. Edmund turned back to the file on his desk. He had no interest in the Hartwell matter beyond what it was. A woman had wanted his chair. He had not given it. She had left. A letter had arrived asking for something he did not believe he owed. He had said so politely. The matter was closed. He had encountered people like Lady Seraphine before, people formed by enormous privilege and careful insulation from consequence, and he had never found them particularly interesting as a category. They were what their circumstances had made them, and their circumstances had made them inflexible and entitled, and usually quite fragile underneath the surface, because a person who has never had to adjust to difficulty has never developed the capacity for it. He did not think much more about her that afternoon. He thought about Arthur Cole, and about the woman with the child, and about the funding gap Oliver had identified in October's medication costs, which was going to require a conversation with the foundation that he was not looking forward to, but which needed to happen before the end of the month. He thought about the book he had been reading in the library at Hartwell Manor, which had turned out to be a good one, and which he had found on the lower shelf, next to a copy of a medical text that was 40 years out of date, and which someone had clearly purchased with great sincerity. He thought about the drainage system for the new ward, which was on his mind because it needed to work correctly, or everything else in the ward would be compromised. And it was always the systems that nobody wanted to think about that determined whether the things everyone wanted to think about could actually function. He finished the file and reached for the next one. The afternoon went on. 3 days after the ball, Seraphine Hartwell had not stopped thinking about Edmund Calloway, which was remarkable, because Seraphine Hartwell did not ordinarily think about people who failed to give her what she wanted. Ordinarily, people who failed to meet her expectations simply fell out of her awareness entirely, like objects that had been moved out of view. She did not dwell on them. She simply redirected her attention to people who were more useful or more interesting. Calloway had not fallen out of her awareness. This was, she had to admit to herself in the very quiet of her dressing room, before her lady's maid arrived each morning, extremely irritating. She understood irritation. Irritation was clean and familiar. It meant something had not gone as it should, and it motivated her to correct the situation until it did. What she was feeling now was in the same family as irritation, but was more complicated. It had a texture like a stone in a shoe, not sharp enough to stop you walking, but present enough that you couldn't quite ignore it. She decided to address it. Seraphine Hartwell had always been a woman of direct action within the social world she knew. When she wanted something, she did not wait for it to come to her. She engineered the circumstances under which it arrived. This was, she believed, simply good sense. The world did not arrange itself on its own. Intelligent people arranged it. So she arranged things. Her first move was the letter, which had already been sent and had already failed, a fact she filed away, without obvious emotion. Edmund's response had been perfectly pleasant and perfectly immovable, which told her two things. He was not easily intimidated, and he was not rude. This made him harder to dismiss as simply impolite. She could not write him off as a bore. He was something more inconvenient than a bore. He was a man who had reasonable manners, and simply did not find her compelling enough to change his behavior. She had never encountered that specific combination before. Her second move required more planning. She had her personal physician, Dr. Hartley, a man of 60 who had been treating the Hartwell family for decades, and who agreed with everything Seraphine and her father said about their own health on principle, contact the hospital foundation on the pretense of seeking a consultation with their leading clinician. The purpose was to arrange a meeting between Seraphine and Edmund at the foundation offices, which was neutral ground, without making it obvious that she had arranged it. The meeting was set for a Wednesday morning. Seraphine arrived in a carriage that was not the Hartwell family carriage. She had taken a hired one, which was unusual enough that her driver had asked twice if she was certain before accepting the instruction. She wore a dress that was well made but not grand. She had considered this carefully. She did not want to arrive at a charitable hospital foundation looking as though she was about to attend a dinner with the foreign secretary. She wanted to arrive looking like a woman of quality, who was, nonetheless, approaching the meeting on reasonably level ground. She was not sure where this instinct had come from. She simply knew, without being able to explain it, that arriving with the full armor of her position would not work on Edmund Calloway. He had already demonstrated that the armor meant nothing to him. Arriving with it again would simply confirm that she had not absorbed the lesson, which was not the impression she wanted to give. The foundation offices were in a building near the river, 3 floors of organized activity, administrators at desks, correspondence being filed, small meetings being conducted in glass-walled rooms along the corridor. A woman at the front desk greeted Seraphine with a pleasant but unhurried efficiency that reminded her, faintly, of Edmund. She was shown to a small meeting room and offered tea. She accepted the tea. Edmund arrived 4 minutes later. He stopped briefly in the doorway when he saw her, and something passed across his face. Not surprise exactly, but a rapid assessment, the kind of expression a person makes when they register that a situation is not quite what they expected, and are deciding how to proceed. Then he came in, set down the folder he was carrying, and sat across from her. "Lady Seraphine," he said. "Dr. Calloway," she said. "Dr. Hartley mentioned a consultation. He didn't mention you specifically. I asked him not to." A short pause. "And the matter you wish to consult about." Seraphine had prepared for this. She had spent 2 days preparing a version of the answer that sounded plausible, something about the Foundation's approach to treatment, something that would allow her to be in the same room as him without it being obvious that the entire reason for being in the same room was to restore some equilibrium that she could not quite name. She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her, with the same calm attention he had directed at her in the library, patient, curious, entirely without anxiety. She said the prepared answer. She spoke about the Foundation's work on respiratory illness in children, which she had read about in a pamphlet she had found in her father's study. She asked a question about treatment approaches. It was a good question, actually. She had thought about it carefully, and it was specific enough that it could not be dismissed as general. Edmund answered it. He answered it thoroughly, and without condescension, and without the particular tone that certain professional men used when explaining things to women. The slightly raised voice, the simplified vocabulary, the tendency to check in every few sentences, as though the listener might have lost the thread. He simply answered it, as he would answer anyone who had asked a reasonable question. Seraphine had not expected that either. She asked a follow-up question, then another. By the third question, she was no longer entirely performing. She had become, without quite intending to, genuinely interested in what he was saying. The work he described at the clinic was not the work of someone seeking recognition. It was the work of someone who had identified a problem and was methodically addressing it. He spoke about a child named William who had come in, 8 months ago, with a respiratory condition so advanced that Edmund had spent 2 nights uncertain whether the boy would recover. He spoke about it without drama, but also without the detachment that would have made it feel like a professional summary. There was something in the way he described it, the nights of uncertainty, the slow improvement, the morning William's mother had brought him in for a follow-up, and he had run across the waiting room. That told Seraphine this was not a story he told often, or for effect. She held her teacup and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Why did you come to Millbank Road? You could have been at a hospital." He looked at her, as though this was a question he found genuinely interesting, rather than impertinent. "Because the hospital had plenty of doctors," he said. "Millbank Road didn't." "That's a simple answer." "Most true answers are," he said. Seraphine looked at the table. She was aware that this conversation had gone in an entirely different direction from any she had planned, and that she was not in control of it, and that this should have alarmed her, and did not quite. She said, "I understand you received a letter from my father's estate." Something shifted in his expression, not discomfort, but a careful attention. "I did," he said. "I didn't send it," she said. My father did. He hears about things and responds to them in his own way. Edmund said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The response you sent back was very polite, she said. There was nothing to be impolite about, he said. You could have apologized, she said. It would have been easier. He considered this. Not in the way people consider things when they are trying to decide what the other person wants to hear. In the way people consider things when they are actually thinking. Probably, he said, but I didn't think I had done anything that required one. Apologizing when I don't believe I've caused harm would be dishonest. I don't find that easier. I find it more uncomfortable. Seraphine looked at him. She had spoken to a great many people in her life. She had spoken to men with titles, and men with money, and men who had both. She had spoken to men who were witty, and men who were charming, and men who told her whatever they believed she wanted to hear, with the polished ease of long practice. She had spoken to very few men who simply told her what they thought, because they thought it was the true thing to say. She set down her teacup. I came here to see if you would apologize in person, she said. She had not planned to say this. It came out with an honesty that surprised her slightly. And, he said. And I can see that you won't, she said. And I'm not certain anymore that you should. He looked at her with that careful, unhurried attention. What made you uncertain? He asked. She did not have a clean answer to that. The uncertainty had arrived sometime in the last 3 days, wearing the shape of small, unwelcome observations. Clara Finch's face, the children in his waiting room, the way the woman's shoulders had relaxed when he spoke to her. I'm still working that out, she said. He nodded, as though this was a completely reasonable thing to say. They spoke for another 20 minutes, not about the apology, and not about the chair, about the foundation mostly, and about the ward they were hoping to open in the spring. Seraphine found herself contributing to the conversation rather than directing it, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. When she stood to leave, he stood too. Thank you for coming, Lady Seraphine, he said. If you have further questions about the Foundation's work, you're welcome to ask them. I may, she said. She left the Foundation offices and walked to her hired carriage and sat in it for a moment before telling the driver where to go. She had come here to win something back. She was leaving without it. But she was also leaving with something she had not brought with her, something she could not quite name, something that sat in her chest, in a way that was unfamiliar and not entirely unpleasant. She thought about it on the way home. She was still thinking about it when she arrived. The third move came a week later. She engineered a dinner at her father's estate, a small one, which was easier to control than a large event. She managed the guest list carefully, including Edmund among 12 other guests in a way that would not be conspicuous. She arranged the seating so that she and Edmund would be placed at the same end of the table, close enough for conversation. She had planned what she would say. She had thought through the angles. She had, in her own particular way, prepared the social terrain the way a general prepares ground before a battle. Edmund arrived slightly late, having come directly from the clinic. He had changed his jacket but not his demeanor. He greeted the other guests pleasantly, found his seat without difficulty, and engaged the person to his left, an older woman who researched plant diseases and rarely got to talk about it, in a conversation about fungal infections in grain crops that clearly delighted her. Seraphine watched this from her end of the table. She had arranged the seating so that she was across from him. She waited for a natural pause in his conversation, then said, Dr. Calloway, I trust your journey wasn't too inconvenient. Not at all, he said. Though I apologize for being late, we had a patient come in near closing time. Is everything all right? The grain researcher asked. Yes, he said. A cut, poorly treated at home, simple enough to fix once it was cleaned properly. He smiled at her. Tell me more about the ergot. How widespread was the outbreak in the eastern counties? Seraphine had not planned for him to spend the dinner talking to someone else. She had not considered that he might prefer it. She ate her soup and listened to the conversation around her, and tried to read the situation. He was not ignoring her deliberately. When she spoke, he responded, pleasantly, and without any evident tension about the previous encounters. But he was not performing interest in her either. He was simply present in the room, interested in what was in front of him, which at that particular moment happened to be grain diseases. By the time the main course arrived, Seraphine had revised her understanding of the situation entirely. She had been approaching this as a social problem to be solved, as a question of leverage and positioning, and the right arrangement of circumstances. She had assumed that if she could just get the right setting in place, the situation would resolve itself in her favor. But Edmund Calloway was not a person who responded to settings. He was a person who responded to truth. And the truth was that Seraphine Hartwell had no idea what truth she was trying to tell him. She spent the rest of the dinner being unusually quiet, which several guests noticed and attributed to fatigue. She spoke when spoken to. She was, by her own standards, almost ordinary. Edmund left shortly after the final course, politely excusing himself with the explanation that he needed an early start. He thanked her father for the evening, said a warm goodbye to the grain researcher, and was gone. He had been entirely pleasant throughout. He had not given her anything to push against. Seraphine sat in the drawing room afterward with the remaining guests, and held a glass of wine she didn't touch, and looked at the fire, and allowed herself, for the first time, to ask the real question underneath all the others. It was not, why won't he apologize? It was not, why won't he give me what I want? It was, why do I want it so much? What is it, exactly, that I'm looking for? She didn't have the answer. But for the first time in her life, she was sitting with the question, instead of simply reaching for something to fill the silence it left. That was new. She did not recognize it as progress. But it was. She had noticed, in the course of these 3 encounters, something about herself that she would not have noticed before. She had noticed the speed with which she read a room, and identified what she wanted from it, and began moving toward that thing, almost before she had consciously decided to. It was a reflex, developed over years of social management, fast, efficient, and entirely automatic. She had been running on that reflex for so long that she had never questioned whether it was serving her. She was questioning it now. The dinner had shown her something the consultation had not quite shown her. That her reflexes, even when pointed at legitimate goals, produced a quality of engagement that was essentially hollow. She had arranged the dinner carefully. She had planned the conversation, positioned herself at the right end of the table, prepared the approaches she would use. She had done all of this with considerable skill. And the result was an evening in which Edmund Calloway had talked about grain diseases with a woman who was genuinely interested in them, and Seraphine had sat across the table, being socially polished, and receiving nothing from it. The hollowness was familiar, she realized. She had felt it many times, at many dinners and gatherings and events, and she had always concluded from it that the problem was with the particular event, that she needed a different kind of evening, a different gathering, different people. She had never considered that the hollowness was coming from her end of the exchange. It was coming from her end. She understood this, sitting in the drawing room after the guests had left, with the clarity that arrives when something you have suspected for a while finally says itself plainly enough to hear. She was performing. She had always been performing. Not dishonestly, she genuinely felt what she appeared to feel, in the sense that she was not pretending to emotions she did not have. But she was presenting a version of herself rather than being herself, because she had spent 24 years learning to present and had never been in a situation that required her to be otherwise. Edmund had not responded to the presentation. He had responded, or not responded, to what was actually there, which, she was now forced to admit, was not very much. There was skill, there was intelligence, there was a considerable amount of social ability aimed in an unproductive direction. There was not, yet, the thing that made people actually want to engage with each other rather than simply occupy the same room. She was not sure what that thing was. She suspected it had something to do with genuinely caring about what the other person was saying. She suspected it had something to do with showing up as an actual person rather than as a social position. She was not sure she knew how to do that. She was not sure she had ever done it. The question that had opened in the library on the night of the ball, "Why did that bother you so much?" had now branched into more questions, all of them pointing in the same direction, all of them asking some version of the same thing. Who are you, actually, underneath the performance? And she did not have a clean answer, which was itself new. She had always had answers. She had always known exactly who she was and what she wanted. She was discovering that what she had always known was the presented version of those things. The actual version was waiting somewhere underneath, unfamiliar and uncertain. She would have to go and find it. She sat in the drawing room until the fire had burned low and most of the candles had guttered, and she thought about what it would mean to try. The message came on a Tuesday morning, and it came quickly. Seraphine was in the upstairs sitting room that she used as her private space, the one with the south-facing windows that let in the best light, and the writing desk she had insisted on replacing 3 times until she found one the right height. She was reading correspondence. She received a great deal of it: invitations, requests from charitable committees who believed the Hartwell name would add weight to their letterhead, notes from acquaintances performing the social maintenance that kept the various networks of the aristocracy functioning. She was reading a letter from a cousin in Bath who wanted her opinion on a wallpaper pattern when the housekeeper, Mrs. Aldous, appeared in the doorway with an expression that Seraphine recognized. It was the expression Mrs. Aldous used when something had happened that she did not know how to frame. "What is it?" Seraphine said. "It's the Duke, my lady," Mrs. Aldous said. "He's been taken ill at Westminster. They're bringing him home." Seraphine set down the letter. She did not move for a moment. She sat very still, and then she stood up in a single controlled motion and said, "When?" "The message arrived a quarter of an hour ago. His secretary says it happened during a session. He collapsed. A physician was called immediately." Mrs. Aldous paused. "They don't know yet how serious it is." Seraphine walked to the window. The garden was in its late autumn state, stripped of most of its color, the bare trees making clean vertical lines against a gray sky. She looked at it without seeing it. Her father was 61 years old. He had always seemed to her to be made of something more durable than ordinary men, broader in the shoulders, louder in his presence, capable of filling a room simply by entering it. He had occasional bouts of breathlessness that he dismissed as nothing, and that the household had learned to dismiss alongside him, because George Hartwell did not discuss his health with anyone, except to announce that there was nothing wrong with it. She turned back from the window. "Prepare the ground floor bedroom," she said. "He should not have to manage the stairs when he arrives. Send for Dr. Hartley immediately. And arrange for everything he might need to be brought down. I don't want him moving between floors for at least the first week." "Yes, my lady. And Mrs. Aldous, no one is to discuss this outside the household, not with callers, not with tradespeople, not in any capacity. Do you understand?" "Completely. Thank you." The housekeeper left. Seraphine stood in the middle of the sitting room for a moment and did the thing she had always done when something threatened to become large and unmanageable. She broke it into pieces and started handling the pieces. She handled many pieces over the next several hours. Her father arrived home in mid-afternoon, leaning on the arm of his secretary, paler than she had ever seen him. His usual substantial presence somehow diminished. He looked, she thought, old. She had never thought of him as old before. She had always seen him as exactly what he was: powerful, dominant, the person who determined the shape of every room he was in. Seeing him reduced to this, shuffling into his own house with careful steps, his face the color of old plaster, did something strange inside her chest. She did not show it. She greeted him in the entrance hall with calm efficiency, directed him toward the ground floor bedroom, and organized his settling in with the same focused precision she brought to everything she considered important. Dr. Hartley arrived within the hour. He examined the Duke for 25 minutes, emerged with an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that communicated very little to Seraphine, and told her that the Duke had experienced what appeared to be a significant episode of the heart, that he would need complete rest, and that they would know more in the coming days. He said this with the particular confidence of a man who was not certain he had identified the full picture. Seraphine noticed this. She had been watching physicians perform confidence her entire life. Dr. Hartley had been the family doctor for 30 years, and she had always accepted his assessments without question, because he had always delivered them with such assurance. But watching his face now, watching the small hesitations between sentences, she saw something she had not been looking for before: uncertainty. She thanked him and showed him out. That evening, the first social withdrawal began. It was subtle, a note from the Wentworths, who had a long-standing arrangement to dine with the Hartwells the following Friday, citing a prior engagement they had only just recalled. Seraphine read the note and set it down and moved on. These things happened. People had prior engagements. The next morning brought 2 more withdrawals, a luncheon canceled, a letter from the secretary of a committee on which her father sat, noting that arrangements for his absence would be made, and expressing wishes for a swift recovery in the careful language of people who are not certain a swift recovery is coming. Seraphine noticed the pattern. She had grown up inside the machinery of aristocratic society. She understood, at a level she had never been required to examine closely, that the warmth directed at the Hartwells was not purely social. It was connected to her father's health, his influence, the assumption that he would continue to occupy the position he occupied. The moment that assumption became uncertain, the warmth began to cool. She had known this, intellectually, the way you know facts about a distant country without having been there. Now she was in the country. She sat in her father's study that evening, managing the correspondence that would otherwise pile up, and she felt, for the first time, the particular chill that came from understanding that the world had been responding to the Hartwell name, and not to her. And the Hartwell name, at this moment, was under pressure. She wrote efficient replies to the incoming letters, rescheduled what could be rescheduled, and declined what needed to be declined. She did it all correctly. She had been trained her whole life to perform the function of a daughter of this family, and she performed it now without error. But her mind kept returning to something else. She thought about Edmund Calloway's voice describing William, the boy who had recovered, the particular quality of attention he brought to that story. She thought about Dr. Hartley's small hesitations and what they might be covering. She thought about her father's face in the entrance hall, diminished, pale, old. She did not sleep well that night. In the morning, she made a decision. It was not the kind of decision she usually made. Her decisions were usually quick, clear, and made from a position of certainty. This one came from somewhere more uncertain. It came from a place that felt uncomfortably like doubt. Doubt in Dr. Hartley. Doubt in the story she was being given. A small but persistent instinct that something was being missed. She did not call Dr. Hartley. She went to Millbank Road. She took the hired carriage again. She arrived just after 9 in the morning. The waiting room was already occupied with several patients. Oliver Grant looked up when she came in, and his expression shifted through several things in rapid succession, before settling on polite surprise. "Lady Seraphine," he said, "do you have an appointment?" "I don't," she said. "I need to speak with Dr. Calloway. It's about my father." Oliver assessed her face for a moment. He had good instincts, she noticed. He was reading her the way people who work in medical settings learn to read faces, looking for the real information underneath the presented one. "I'll tell him you're here," Oliver said. "He's with someone at the moment." "I'll wait," she said. She sat in the waiting room. It was a plain room, clean, simply furnished, with 2 windows that let in reasonable light. There were children's drawings on one wall, pinned with care. She looked at them while she waited. A wobbly blue house, a figure with enormous hands, a dog that might have been a horse. Edmund appeared in the doorway 12 minutes later. He looked at her with the same unhurried attention he always brought to things, and something in his expression told her that he had already guessed, at least in outline, why she was there. "Lady Seraphine," he said. "Come through." She followed him into his office, which was a small room, crowded with books and files, and a desk that had clearly been chosen for function rather than appearance. He sat down, and she sat across from him, and for once, she did not arrange herself into a position of composure. She sat the way she actually was. "My father is ill," she said. "He collapsed at Westminster 2 days ago. His physician says it's his heart, but I don't think his physician is seeing the full picture." She said it plainly, without performance. She was not trying to maneuver here. She was trying to get to the truth. Edmund did not respond immediately. He picked up a pen and set it down again, which she was beginning to recognize as something he did when he was thinking. "The way Hartley talks," she said, "the spaces between what he says. He's confident about some things, and evasive about others. He told me my father needs rest, and that we'll know more in a few days. But he didn't give me a clear picture of what he actually found, or what he's looking for." Edmund said, "That might simply be how he communicates." "I know how he communicates," she said. "I've been watching him for 20 years. He's hiding uncertainty behind a professional manner." Edmund looked at her carefully. "You're asking me to consult," he said. "I'm asking you to tell me if I'm wrong," she said. "I want to be wrong. I want Hartley to be correct, and my father to be resting and fine in 2 weeks. But if he's not, I need someone who will actually tell me what they see." There was a long moment. Edmund said, I would need to examine him properly, and Hartley would need to know I was involved. I won't work around another physician without their knowledge. It wouldn't be appropriate. I'll speak to Hartley, she said. And your father would need to agree. He'll agree, she said. And then, more quietly, he'll agree, because I'll ask him to. Edmund looked at her for a moment longer. There was something in his face she was beginning to recognize. That careful, honest assessment. All right, he said. I have appointments until noon. I can come this afternoon. She stood. Thank you, she said. The words came out without any of the particular tone she usually applied to words that other people might have expected to arrive with warmth. They came out plainly and directly, because she meant them plainly and directly, and for once that was enough. She went home. She told her father there was a second physician coming. Her father, lying in the ground floor bedroom looking more tired than she had ever seen him, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Who?" "Edmund Calloway," she said. "He runs a clinic on Millbank Road. He works with the hospital foundation." Her father frowned. "Is this about that business at the ball?" "This is about your health," she said. "And I want someone who will tell me the truth about it." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, with an expression she could not fully read. "All right," he said. She straightened the blanket at the end of his bed, which did not need straightening. "Thank you," she said. For the second time that day, she meant it. Edmund arrived at 4 in the afternoon. He was met by Dr. Hartley, who had been given notice of the visit and who arrived wearing the stiff politeness of a professional who feels his territory is being questioned. The two men shook hands in the entrance hall and exchanged the careful pleasantries of people sizing each other up. Seraphine watched from the doorway and said nothing. Edmund spent 40 minutes with her father. Hartley was in the room. Seraphine waited in the corridor, which was unusual enough that Mrs. Aldous checked on her twice. When Edmund emerged, he asked Seraphine if there was somewhere they could speak privately. They went to the sitting room. He sat across from her and he did not hesitate, which she was grateful for. "Your father has a significant problem with his heart," he said. "Hartley's diagnosis is not wrong, but his management plan is incomplete. There are things he hasn't tested for and things he isn't monitoring closely enough. Your father's condition is serious. With the right care, there is every reason to expect he can recover meaningfully and have several more good years. Without it," he paused, not for effect, but because the next words needed to be accurate. "Without it, the risks are significant." Seraphine looked at the window. "What does he need?" she said. Edmund laid it out, not simply, not in the condensed version, for people who were not expected to understand medical matters. In full, with detail, with the things that needed to be done, and the things that needed to be watched for, and the things that would indicate improvement versus decline. Seraphine listened to all of it, without interrupting. When he was finished, she said, "Will you oversee his care, alongside Hartley?" "If Hartley agrees," Edmund said. "I won't do it otherwise. I'll speak to Hartley." "There's something else," Edmund said. She looked at him. "Your father is going to need to make changes to how he lives. His diet. How much he exerts himself. How much stress he carries." He looked at her steadily. "He'll need to actually follow that guidance. Some patients hear this, and then spend the first month following the plan, and the second month deciding they're recovered enough to return to their usual habits. That approach tends to produce second episodes that are worse than the first. I'll make sure he follows it," she said. Something moved in Edmund's expression. Not doubt, but a careful kind of thought. "You can't make someone follow medical guidance," he said. "You can support it, but it has to come from him." She wanted to disagree with this. She had spent her entire life making things happen through will alone, and it had always worked. The idea that there was something she could not enforce was not comfortable. But she looked at Edmund's face, and she thought of the children in the waiting room, and the grain researcher at the dinner table, and William, who had recovered, and she said nothing. "I understand," she said. He left an hour later. Seraphine stood in the sitting room after he was gone and looked at the gray sky through the window. The household was quiet around her. Her father was resting downstairs. The correspondence was sitting on the desk. She picked up the first letter. She opened it. She began to read. She worked until 11 that night. Not because she had to. Because for the first time, she was not waiting for someone to arrange things around her. She was arranging them herself. And it felt, she discovered, entirely different from how she had expected it to feel. It felt like something real. On the evening of the third day after Edmund's first visit, Seraphine sat in the sitting room adjacent to her father's bedroom with a letter she needed to write, and found herself unable to write it because she was listening to the sounds her father made as he slept. The occasional shift, the particular quality of his breathing, which Edmund had described to her in exact terms, what it should sound like if things were stable, what it would sound like if they were not. She had absorbed this information with the same thorough attention she was now bringing to everything Edmund told her, and she was monitoring it now without having decided to monitor it, because the information had made the monitoring automatic. She thought about this, about the difference between caring and managing. She had managed her father's household for 3 months now, efficiently and without error, and she was beginning to understand that managing was not the same as caring, even when it produced the same outcomes. Managing was what you did when you were responsible for something. Caring was what you felt when the thing mattered to you in itself, not as a problem to be handled, but as a person to be present with. She had been managing. She was beginning to care. This surprised her, which was itself informative. She had believed, when she began this, that she loved her father in the straightforward way. She was discovering that what she had felt before was something more like devotion to a function he served in her life, the authority that arranged things, the approval she measured her success against, the name that gave her the position she occupied. These were real feelings, but they were feelings about what he provided, not about who he was. Who he was, she was learning, was someone more complicated and more human than she had previously seen. He was someone who was frightened of losing things he loved. He was someone who had responded to that fear in ways that had caused harm without intending to. He was someone who had carried guilt for years, in the particular way that people carry guilt when they have made decisions they cannot reverse, and cannot quite bring themselves to examine directly. He was, she thought, watching the lamplight on the ceiling above the doorway, someone she could actually know, if she was willing to look at him as he was, rather than as the function he served. She was willing. She set down the letter she had been failing to write, and went into her father's room, and sat in the chair beside his bed in the quiet, and she simply sat there for a while, without trying to do anything, without having a plan for the sitting, without it needing to produce any particular outcome. He woke briefly, registered her presence, and went back to sleep. She stayed until the lamp burned low. Then she went to her own room and slept better than she had in weeks. Margaret Baines had worked for the Hartwell family for 31 years. She had come to the house as a girl of 17, hired as a kitchen girl by the housekeeper who was there before Mrs. Aldous, back when George Hartwell's father was still alive, and the estate ran on different rhythms. She had watched Seraphine born, had been in the house during the long night of the birth, carrying hot water and clean linens up the stairs while the household held its breath. She had watched 2 boys buried in the churchyard, small graves that the Duke visited every autumn without telling anyone where he was going. She had watched Seraphine grow from an infant to a child to the young woman she was now. She knew Seraphine better than Seraphine knew. She was 74, and her knees troubled her on cold mornings, and her memory sometimes did things it should not do, returning her, without warning, to conversations and rooms and years that were long past, so that she would find herself halfway through a sentence before realizing she was in the present rather than the past. These lapses were not yet severe. She knew them for what they were. She managed them quietly and went about her work, which at this stage of her employment was less demanding than it had once been, mostly light tasks in the upper corridor and the smaller rooms, work that did not require the stairs she could no longer navigate quickly. On a Thursday afternoon in early December, Seraphine came to the upper corridor to retrieve a book from the small reading room at the end of the hall. Margaret was in the corridor, dusting the frames of the paintings that lined it. She did not hear Seraphine approach. Her hearing was not what it once was on the right side. When she registered someone entering the corridor, her mind did something it occasionally did. She went somewhere else. Not fully. Not completely. But enough that when she turned and saw a young, dark-haired woman in a blue dress, she did not think, Lady Seraphine. She thought of someone else. A niece, perhaps. Or a neighbor's daughter, long since gone. Some face from 30 years ago that this one momentarily resembled. She said, Goodness, You gave me a fright. Have you come to see the mistress? Seraphine stopped walking. The young mistress, Margaret continued, her voice light, conversational. The voice of an old woman, talking to someone she thought she recognized. She'll be in the lower rooms. I'd stay out of her way if I were you, mind. She's in one of her moods today. You know how she gets. Sets the whole house on edge. She clicked her tongue gently, not unkindly, the way old women do when they are fond of someone despite everything. Poor girl. Never been told no in her life. Doesn't know what to do with herself when things don't go her way. Terrifying temper when something's not to her liking. She shook her head slightly. Not her fault, I always said. Spoiled from the cradle. The Duke wouldn't hear a word against her. Everyone just gave in. Gave in and gave in until she didn't know any other way. Seraphine stood very still. Margaret dusted the corner of a painting frame and continued in the same soft, reminiscent tone. Kind underneath it, I always thought. Somewhere there's a good heart. Just buried under all those years of no one ever telling her the truth. That's the sad part. If even one person, just once. She paused, tilting her head. Oh, but I'm chattering. Don't mind me. I'll be here all afternoon if you want to wait. She turned slightly, and her eyes adjusted, and something happened in her face. She saw who she was talking to. The color left her cheeks. The dusting cloth went still in her hands. There was a silence that lasted several seconds. Seraphine thought she had never seen an old woman look so frightened in her life. My lady, Margaret said. Her voice had gone very small. Seraphine looked at her. She looked at this woman, who had worked in her house for 31 years, who had carried linens and hot water on the night she was born, who had just said the truest thing anyone had ever said about her. Not because she meant to, but because for a moment, she had forgotten she was speaking to the person she was describing. The words were still in the corridor. They had nowhere to go. Margaret had gone rigid. Her hands were pressing the dusting cloth so hard the knuckles had turned pale. She was waiting. She was waiting for the storm, for the cold voice, for the dismissal, for the particular way Seraphine's silence became a weather system before she spoke. Seraphine did not speak for a very long time. She stood in the corridor, with the December light coming through the window at the end, and she looked at this old woman, and she heard the words again, as though they were still arriving. Never been told no in her life. Doesn't know what to do with herself. Not her fault. Spoiled from the cradle. Kind underneath it. Just buried. She was not angry. She should have been, perhaps. She had always been angry when things were turned against her. But she was not angry now. She was something else entirely. Something that had no familiar shape. That sat in her chest like something broken, and something new at the same time. She said, "Is there anything I can do for you, Margaret?" The old woman blinked. The dusting cloth dropped 2 inches in her hands. She stared at Seraphine with an expression that was not relief, and was not suspicion, and was not gratitude. It was something more complicated than any of those. It was the expression of someone who had been braced for one thing for so long that the arrival of the other thing was almost harder to absorb. "My lady?" she said carefully. "You've worked here a long time," Seraphine said. Her voice was quiet. She was not performing this. She was simply speaking. "I'm asking if there's anything you need." Margaret looked at her. She looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "My knees trouble me on the cold mornings. The stairs to the linen room are difficult." "I'll have the linen storage moved to the lower corridor," Seraphine said. "Today." Margaret said nothing. Seraphine looked at the painting on the wall. It was a landscape, fields and a gray sky, and a tree at the edge of the frame that leaned slightly to the right, as though pushed by decades of wind. She had walked past it 10,000 times, and never stopped to look at it. "Was I very bad?" she said. She was not sure she intended to say it. It came out quietly, aimed at the painting rather than Margaret. The silence that followed was careful. "You were what you were made to be," Margaret said at last. "It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. We all knew that." A pause. "You just didn't see us, my lady. Not really." That was the hardest part. Seraphine looked at the painting. "I know," she said. She did not know what to do next, so she did the only thing she could think of. She asked Margaret about her sister in Ipswich, who Margaret mentioned sometimes to the other staff. She had not known until this moment that she had absorbed this detail. She listened while Margaret talked about the sister, a woman named Frances who kept a small garden and had 3 grandchildren, for several minutes, and she listened in the way Edmund listened, without waiting for her turn, without planning her next sentence. When Margaret finished, Seraphine nodded. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said, even though you didn't mean for me to hear it." She went to retrieve her book. She sat in the reading room with it open on her knee, and did not read a single word of it. She was thinking about what it felt like to be seen accurately for the first time. It did not feel like what she had expected. She had expected it to feel like an attack. She had spent her whole life positioning herself so that no one could see underneath the surface, so that the surface was all there was, so smooth and controlled that nothing could gain purchase on it. But Margaret had seen underneath, not as an attack, and not even deliberately. She had simply said a true thing in the dark, and Seraphine had been standing there. She closed the book and set it on the table beside her. She thought about Clara Finch, who had walked back into town in the cold for a ribbon and had said nothing. She thought about the footman at the library door who had gone rigid with anticipation the night Edmund had refused to give up his chair. She thought about the maids on the staircase who had immediately started pretending to be busy. She thought about Edmund's words. "You can't make someone follow medical guidance. You can support it. You can't make people do things. You can only arrange yourself in relation to them." She had never, in 24 years, arranged herself in relation to anyone. She had only ever arranged everyone else in relation to her. She sat in the reading room while the December light faded in the window, and she sat with this understanding, the way you sit with something heavy, not comfortable, not resolved, but real. More real than anything she had felt in a very long time. Downstairs, her father was resting. His condition was stable, but required careful management. Edmund came on Thursdays to review his progress. Hartley had accepted the arrangement, with the good grace of a man who had been given no real alternative, and who was, if Seraphine was honest, relieved to have the additional oversight. She had not told Edmund about Margaret. She was not sure why. Perhaps because it was too new, still too unfinished. Perhaps because the person who would have told a story like that was not yet the person she was. She would be, though. She could feel it. The slow, uncomfortable rearrangement happening somewhere inside her, like bones adjusting after a long time of being held wrong. It was not pleasant. But it was genuine, and she was, for perhaps the first time in her life, choosing genuine over comfortable. She picked up her book again. She began, this time, to actually read it. She sat for a long time in the reading room after Margaret left, with the December light at the window, going from afternoon to early dark. And she thought about what she had been told. Not what Margaret had said about her, though she would think about that for a long time. She thought about what Margaret had said about the household, about the 30 years she had been in this building, had been part of the particular daily life of the Hartwell family, had carried things and cleaned things and repaired things and observed things, and had done all of it without ever once, in 31 years, being asked a direct question about her own situation. Seraphine had not asked it. She was the one who had finally asked it, and she had asked it because Margaret had given her the truth accidentally, and something in that truth had opened a space where a question could arrive, and the question was, "Is there anything I can do for you?" A simple question, a question anyone might ask, a question Seraphine had never asked, not because she could not form the words, but because the idea of asking had simply never presented itself. The people around her were there to manage things, to adjust things, to ensure that Seraphine's days ran according to the shape she had decided they should take, that these people had their own situations, their own difficulties, their own knees that troubled them on cold mornings. This had not been part of any framework she had operated within. She was beginning to understand how much framework she had been missing. She thought about Edmund, who had spent 3 years treating patients on Millbank Road with the same careful attention, regardless of who they were or what they brought with them. She thought about how he had described William's recovery, not as a professional achievement, but as something he had genuinely cared about the outcome of. She thought about the way the woman in the waiting room had relaxed when he spoke to her, that particular releasing of tension that happens when someone realizes they are being actually seen rather than processed. She had never produced that effect in anyone. She had produced the opposite effect. She produced the careful attention of people managing themselves in relation to her, bracing themselves, preparing for the weather. She had been, for 24 years, a weather system rather than a person. She had thought this was normal. She had thought it was power. She was beginning to understand it was loneliness, wearing the costume of power. This was not a comfortable understanding. She sat with it in the fading light, and she did not try to make it less than it was, because she had been trying to make things less than they were for a very long time, and she could see now what that had cost her. Making things smaller than they were was not the same as managing them. It was the same as leaving them unaddressed while pretending they had been handled. She thought about her father. She thought about the particular shape of his love for her. Real, she believed, genuinely real, but distorted by fear into something that had produced the opposite of what he intended. He had wanted to give her a life without difficulty. He had given her a life without texture, without the friction that teaches people what they are made of, without the experience of discovering that disappointment does not destroy you, and that other people's refusals are not evidence that the world is against you, but simply evidence that other people exist. She thought about all the things he had arranged that she had not known he was arranging, the people who had been managed away from her periphery, the consequences that had been quietly absorbed before they could reach her, the entire invisible architecture of accommodation that she had spent 24 years walking through without knowing it was there, believing it was the natural response to who she was, rather than something constructed specifically to keep reality at a distance. She was in contact with reality now. It was, she found, more interesting than what she had been living in before. She stood up from the chair and went to the window and looked at the dark garden. The December cold had settled against the glass, and the breath she let out was visible for a moment before it disappeared. She thought about what she was going to do. Not with Margaret. That was already done, in the best and only way it could be done. She had asked the question, and heard the answer, and she would have the linen storage moved, as she had said, and she would make a point of knowing Margaret's situation better than she had before. That was small, and it was not sufficient to undo 31 years, but it was real, and it was where she could actually put her hands. She thought about what else she could put her hands to. The list was long. She was beginning to understand how long it was. She had spent 24 years in motion, always occupied, always managing some version of her own social position, or her own desires, and she had produced very little actual good with any of that motion. She had expended enormous energy in the maintenance of something that had, it turned out, not been worth the maintaining. That energy was still there. It had always been there. It was simply a matter of what she pointed it at. She turned from the window. She went to the writing desk in the corner of the reading room, a small desk she had always overlooked in favor of the larger one in the sitting room, and she sat down at it, and she opened the notebook she had brought with her for the book she had not read. She wrote down the names of 3 people she could think of immediately, who she had treated badly in ways that could, potentially, be addressed. She looked at the list. She added 2 more names. Then she closed the notebook and held it in her hands for a moment, in the dark room, with the winter pressing against the glass, and she made a decision that was quiet and unwitnessed and not performed for anyone, including herself. She was going to start with what was in front of her. She was going to do the work that was actually there to do, one piece at a time, without expecting it to be clean or resolved or rewarded. She was going to stop waiting for someone to arrange things into the shape she wanted, and start doing the work of arriving at the shape the world actually was. She went downstairs. She asked Mrs. Aldous to have the linen storage moved to the lower corridor. Mrs. Aldous said she would see to it first thing tomorrow. Seraphine said, "Thank you," and then, because it was true, "You manage this house very well, Mrs. Aldous. I should have said so before now." Mrs. Aldous looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you, my lady," she said, carefully. Seraphine went to check on her father. He was sleeping. She stood in the doorway of his room and looked at him for a moment, at the unfamiliar smallness of him in the bed, at the pale, careful quality of his breathing, at the man she had built her entire life around and had never quite seen. She was seeing him now. She pulled the door to, leaving it slightly open, and went to her own room and sat at her dressing table and looked at herself for a long time. In 6 months, she would be 25. She thought she was finally beginning to understand what that meant. The first attempt felt like the right thing to do for about 40 minutes. Seraphine had located Clara Finch through the Dressmakers Guild registry. A straightforward process once she had decided to pursue it. Clara worked from her home, a terraced house on a narrow street near the market, where she had a front room fitted out as a workroom, with a long cutting table and 2 good windows for light. Seraphine arrived on a Wednesday morning in a hired carriage, wearing a coat that was fine but not ostentatious, and knocked on the door the way a person knocks when they are not entirely sure of their welcome. Clara opened the door. Recognition moved across her face in stages. First, the general recognition of a visitor, then the specific recognition of who the visitor was, and then a very careful stillness that replaced whatever the natural expression would have been. "Lady Seraphine," she said. Her voice was measured. "Miss Finch," Seraphine said. "I wonder if I might come in." There was a pause. Clara stepped back and held the door open. The workroom was neat and very organized. Fabrics sorted by weight and color on long shelves, a half-finished garment on a stand near the far window, spools of thread arranged in a way that suggested someone who found order genuinely satisfying, rather than merely functional. It smelled of clean cotton and faint wood smoke from the small stove in the corner. Seraphine stood in the center of the room, because there was nowhere obvious to sit, and she had not been invited to. She said, "I came to apologize for how I treated you. The morning of the autumn ball. The ribbon." Clara looked at her steadily. "I was unreasonable," Seraphine said. "You had done exceptional work and I dismissed it over a detail that, on reflection, was not worth what I made it into. You were asked to make an impossible change, in an impossible time frame, and you did it without complaint. I should have said so at the time." The room was quiet. Clara said, "Thank you, my lady." She said it with perfect correctness. Not warmth, not relief, not the tearful gratitude that Seraphine had privately and shamefully imagined might be part of how this went. Just 2 words, delivered with the politeness of someone who has been required to be polite for a very long time, to people who did not always deserve it. Seraphine had been prepared for many responses. She had not been fully prepared for this one. "I mean it," she said. "I understand," Clara said. There was another silence. Seraphine looked at the half-finished garment on the stand. The stitching along the neckline was extraordinary, tiny, perfectly even, the kind of work that required both skill and patience in equal measure. "Your work is remarkable," she said. And then, because she meant it, it always has been. Clara looked at the garment, then back at her. Something shifted slightly in her expression, not warmth, but a faint reduction of the careful distance. "Thank you," she said again, and this time, there was something in it that was almost real. Seraphine left 10 minutes later. She sat in the carriage and looked at her hands and tried to decide what she felt. It was not the resolution she had imagined. There had been no moment of mutual understanding, no sense of a wrong cleanly righted. Clara had accepted the apology with grace and without forgiveness, which was entirely her right, and which told Seraphine something she was finding difficult but necessary to absorb. You did not apologize to receive something. You apologized because something needed to be said. The receiving was up to the other person. She had spent 24 years operating on the assumption that every interaction was something she could direct to a satisfying outcome. She had spent 24 years being right about that. Now she was discovering, one encounter at a time, that there were outcomes you could not direct, that other people's feelings and responses belonged to them and not to her, no matter how clearly she could see what she wanted from the exchange. She told the driver to take her home. Over the following weeks, she made other small corrections. Not announced, not performed, not done in any way that would produce visible credit. She went through the estate accounts with a thoroughness she had never previously applied, and found a number of small debts that her father had let accumulate with local tradespeople. A butcher, a printer who had produced materials for various household events, a man who supplied the estate's firewood, and who had been sending invoices for 2 years without resolution. She settled them from her own allowance, not because she expected anyone to notice, but because they were owed. She found a shoemaker on the high street, who she had returned goods to 3 times in 1 year, each time citing a defect that, upon honest reflection, had not existed. She did not attempt to visit him. That felt like a reach too far in the wrong direction. Instead, she sent a note commissioning a pair of boots, prepaid in full, at more than the stated price, with a note that said only, "For previous inconvenience, no signature." She suspected he would know who it was from. She found the family of a housekeeper who had been dismissed 2 years ago after a confrontation with Seraphine that had been, by any honest accounting, caused entirely by Seraphine. The woman had obtained new employment, but had lost 2 months of income during the transition. Seraphine arranged for an anonymous payment equal to those wages through the household accounts, attributed to a discretionary fund that she had the authority to use. She did not tell Edmund about any of this. She was not entirely sure why she kept thinking about what Edmund would think. It was not his opinion she was seeking. She had not decided to do any of these things because she imagined him observing them and revising his assessment of her. She had decided to do them because they were the right things to do. But she noticed that she thought of him while doing them. She thought of the way he had said, "Most true answers are simple." She thought of the way he had described William, the boy who recovered, without drama and without detachment. She thought of the way he had told her, honestly and directly, that she could not make her father follow medical guidance. She thought about the particular quality of his attention, the way he looked at things as they actually were, not as he wished them to be or feared them to be. She was beginning to understand that this quality was rare. She was beginning to understand that she had spent her whole life surrounded by people who told her things as they thought she wanted to hear them, and that this had left her with a profoundly distorted picture of the world. Edmund had not distorted anything. He had simply looked at her and seen her and said the true thing, and it had felt like an assault because she had never been treated that way before. She thought about this on a Thursday afternoon in December, while Edmund was reviewing her father's progress in the ground floor bedroom. She was in the sitting room adjacent, within earshot but not in the room. She could hear the low exchange of voices, her father's still rough and effortful, Edmund's steady and clear. She heard her father laugh, briefly, at something Edmund said. She did not remember the last time she had heard her father laugh. He had always been in her life as a formal presence, the source of approval, or the object of management, a figure of authority who arranged the world around her. She had not thought of him as someone who laughed. She got up and went to stand in the doorway. Edmund was at the foot of the bed, writing something in his notebook. Her father was sitting upright against the pillows, looking better than he had 2 weeks ago, more color, less of that terrible flattened quality that had been so frightening in the first days. He saw her in the doorway and said, "Seraphine, come in." She came in and sat in the chair beside the bed. Edmund finished his note and looked up. "He's improving," Edmund said, steadily. "The changes have been working." He looked at her father. "Keep doing what you're doing. No change to the plan yet." Her father said, "She won't let me deviate from it." He said this without resentment, almost with warmth, which was unusual. "Good," Edmund said simply. Seraphine looked at her father. He looked older than he had before the illness, and smaller, in some way that had nothing to do with physical size. She thought about what he had tried to give her. Every want satisfied, every disappointment deflected, every person who might have offered friction, carefully removed. She thought about what it had cost both of them. "Dr. Calloway," she said, "when you first came to the clinic on Millbank Road, did you know it would be difficult?" Edmund considered the question. He did it seriously, the way he did everything. "I knew the practical difficulties," he said. "The funding, the hours, the limited resources, yes." "And the other kind?" she said. He looked at her. "The loneliness of it, you mean?" She had not used that word, but she recognized it when he said it. "Somewhat," he said quietly. "There are days that are very hard, days when you do everything right and the outcome is still wrong, days when the funding falls short, or a patient doesn't come back because the journey is too much effort, or because they've decided it's not worth trying." He paused. "But then there are days when it's exactly what it should be, and those days are sufficient." Seraphine looked at the window. "Sufficient," she said. "Yes," he said. "More than sufficient, sometimes." Her father was watching this exchange with an expression she could not quite read. Edmund put on his coat. "Thursday next," he said to her father. "Same time. Do the walking exercises in the afternoon if the weather allows." "Not too long." Her father said, "Thank you, Edmund." The use of the first name surprised her. Her father did not use first names casually. He operated within the formalities of address with great consistency. The fact that he had shifted with Edmund, at some point in the past weeks, without her noticing, said something she was still working to understand. Edmund left. Seraphine sat with her father for a while after he was gone. They did not talk much. There was a quality to the quiet between them now that was different from how it had always been, less managed, less performed. Her father had done something in the week after Edmund's first visit that she had not expected. He had told her the truth about the letters. Not the letter to Edmund, which she had already known about. Other letters, over the years. Small interventions. Pressures applied, situations arranged. Whenever someone had failed to accommodate Seraphine in the way he expected. He had told her this not as a confession, with elaborate remorse, but with the direct, tired honesty of a man who was looking at things clearly, for perhaps the first time in a very long while. She had sat with it. She was still sitting with it. You know, her father said from the pillows, that physician of yours is the first person in a long time who told me something I didn't want to hear. He has a talent for it, she said. Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're different, Seraphine, since the autumn. She looked at the window again. I know, she said. He said, Is it good? She thought about Clara Finch's 2 careful words. She thought about Margaret in the corridor. She thought about the shoemaker's boots, and the tradespeople's accounts, and the housekeeper's family, and the small, unglamorous, unwitnessed work of the past weeks. I think so, she said. I'm not sure yet. Her father reached out and put his hand over hers. He had done this when she was small, held her hand. She had forgotten. She sat very still, because she was afraid that if she moved, something delicate would break. She looked at their hands, and then she looked at his face, and she saw, for the first time with real clarity, that he was afraid of her, had always been, in some way, afraid of her pain, afraid of her disappointment, afraid of the grief behind every decision he had made. He had tried to protect her, and had produced something that needed protecting from itself. I'm sorry, he said, for some of how it was. She did not say it was fine. It wasn't fine, but it was also not the end of anything. We'll manage, she said. She held his hand until he fell asleep. Then she sat for a while longer in the quiet room, with the winter afternoon pressing against the windows and the sound of the house going on around her, ordinary and ongoing, and she thought about Edmund saying sufficient. More than sufficient, sometimes. She thought she was beginning to understand what that meant. Not happiness as she had always imagined it, a state that arrived when everything was arranged correctly, but something more durable, something that came from the inside out rather than the outside in. She would have to build it. She had no idea how. But she was beginning. She did not tell anyone about the shoemaker, or the tradespeople's accounts, or the housekeeper's family. She did not tell her father, who would have been moved by it in ways that were not the point. She did not tell Mrs. Aldous, who would have told the other staff, and the knowing of it would have changed the texture of something that needed to remain simple. She did not tell Edmund, though she continued to think of him while doing these things, not as an imagined audience but as a kind of internal reference point, the way you might hold a compass bearing in your mind when navigating unfamiliar ground. What she was navigating was unfamiliar, in ways she had not anticipated. She had expected the work of repair to feel like restitution, like settling accounts, clear and transactional. She had expected the satisfaction of it to be clean. What she found instead was that the work produced a different kind of feeling. Not satisfaction, but something quieter and more complicated. Something that had to do with seeing the gap clearly between what she had been and what she was trying to become, and understanding that the gap was large and the crossing of it was slow. She had spent 24 years arranging things. The instinct was still there. She noticed it constantly. The impulse to manage situations toward a conclusion she had decided on. To position herself advantageously. To read a room and determine what was required of her socially and produce it efficiently. These were things she was good at, and she was not going to become less good at them simply because she had decided to use them differently. The question was what she aimed them at. Frances Page and the charity meetings were helping her understand that aim. The women who ran those meetings brought the same qualities Seraphine had: organizational intelligence, social awareness, the ability to read a room and know what was needed. But they aimed them consistently at other people rather than at themselves. This sounded simple when she put it that way. It was not simple in practice. She had begun to see, in the past weeks, how often her instinct to help was actually an instinct to be helpful, in a way that produced credit for helping. These were not the same thing. A person who helps in order to be seen helping is producing a performance of help, which feels different to the recipient from actual help, even when the practical outcome is identical. The person who is helped can often sense the difference. She had been producing performances her entire life. She was learning to produce the thing itself. This was harder, she found, than she had expected. Not because she lacked the capacity for it, but because it required a sustained attention to her own motivations that was uncomfortable in a particular way. The discomfort of someone who has always believed they knew themselves, and is discovering that what they knew was a managed version of themselves, carefully maintained in the place of the actual. She thought about this on an afternoon in January, when she was at the charity meeting, and a new woman joined for the first time. Someone who had heard about the organization and had come in a way that reminded Seraphine, painfully and with useful clarity, of her own first visit. The woman was overdressed for the room, which was a small thing but visible. She sat at the end of a row and said nothing for most of the meeting, and had an expression on her face that Seraphine recognized from the inside. The expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they were not certain of, and is watching carefully before deciding how to present themselves. At the end of the meeting, Seraphine went and sat beside her. Not to manage the situation, not to make herself useful in a visible way, because she understood what that expression felt like, and because it was possible to do something about it, and because doing something about it was simply what the moment required. She said, "I was new here not long ago. It gets less strange." The woman looked at her. "I wasn't sure I had the right kind of background for this work," the woman said. "Neither was I," Seraphine said. "I'm still finding out." They talked for a few minutes. Seraphine did not offer advice. She asked questions, listened to the answers, said nothing that required the other woman to position herself in any particular way. When they left the building, she had learned that the woman's name was Caroline Hatch, that she had been a governess for 10 years and had recently stopped and was looking for work that was different from that, and that she was very good at arithmetic, which the charity needed. She mentioned this to Frances Page on the way out. Frances said, "I'll speak to her." Seraphine walked home. She thought about what it meant to be useful, not useful in the sense she had always understood, as someone whose presence in a room elevated the room's standing, whose patronage lent an enterprise credibility, whose approval was sought and valued. Useful in the sense of, she had noticed something, mentioned it to the person who could do something about it, and then stepped out of the way. That was what useful actually looked like, she was learning. Much smaller and much more frequent than she had imagined. Not the grand gesture, but the persistent attention. The letter arrived in a cream envelope with a name on it she recognized. A name from a particular autumn evening, 7 years ago, when Seraphine had been 17 and had done something she had not thought about since, or had not allowed herself to. The name was Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor had been her closest companion from the age of 11 until 17, the kind of friendship that forms in girlhood and carries the weight of shared secrets and shared afternoons, and the particular intimacy of two people who know each other at a time before they have learned to manage what they show. Eleanor had been clever and warm, and had laughed easily, which Seraphine had always found slightly enviable, because her own laughter had to be earned through something genuinely surprising before it arrived. When they were 17, something had happened at a summer gathering that involved a young man Eleanor had been fond of, and Seraphine had done something that she had understood even at the time was wrong, had said something publicly and carelessly that had embarrassed Eleanor in a way that was not repairable within the social context of that afternoon. The young man had turned his attention elsewhere. Eleanor had gone very quiet. 2 weeks later, Eleanor's family had moved to Somerset for reasons that had nothing to do with Seraphine. But Eleanor had not written, and Seraphine had not written either. And the friendship had ended in the particular way that friendships end, when one person has hurt the other, and neither of them knows how to speak across the hurt. Seraphine had not thought about Eleanor much in the years since. She thought about her now. She had found Eleanor's address through a mutual acquaintance, a woman who had been at school with both of them, and who had maintained a loose correspondence with Eleanor over the years. Seraphine had written without explaining the reason, only asking, and the address had arrived. The letter she wrote to Eleanor had taken her 3 attempts over 2 evenings. The first version was too formal. It was the letter of someone performing an apology rather than giving one. carefully worded, well-structured, designed to present her in the best possible light, while still technically saying the right things. She read it back and felt nothing, which was a reliable indicator. The second version went too far in the other direction, rambling, over-explanatory, filling every silence with justification. She stopped halfway through and put it aside. The third version was short. She told Eleanor what had happened 7 years ago from her own perspective, without minimizing and without excessive elaboration. She said that she had been careless and unkind, and that it had ended something she should have valued more than she did. She said she was not asking for anything in return. She only wanted Eleanor to know. She sent it. Eleanor's reply arrived 2 weeks later. Seraphine opened it at her desk in the sitting room on a gray January morning, with the fire going and her tea getting cold. Eleanor's handwriting was the same as it had always been, slanted, energetic, slightly too large for the lines. She wrote that she had read the letter twice, that she appreciated it more than Seraphine might expect, that she had been hurt, genuinely, and had carried it for longer than was probably healthy, but that she was glad to receive the acknowledgement, because she had sometimes wondered, over the years, whether Seraphine had ever thought about it at all. She said she was not sure what friendship between them would look like now, if it was even possible. They were different people at 31 than they had been at 17, but she was willing to correspond, and she was curious about the woman Seraphine seemed to be becoming. That last phrase sat with Seraphine for a long time. The woman she seemed to be becoming. She wrote back that same afternoon. She told Eleanor about her father's illness, factually, without drama. She told her about Edmund Calloway, not as a romance, but as what he actually was, the first person who had treated her as ordinary, and what that had started in her. She told her about Margaret in the corridor, and about the tradespeople's accounts, and about the way Clara Finch had accepted her apology, with 2 words that were both the right response and entirely unsatisfying. She told Eleanor she was not sure who she was becoming either, but that she was fairly certain it required being honest about who she had been. Their letters began to arrive with increasing frequency. Edmund noticed, during his Thursday visit in January, that something about Seraphine's manner had shifted again. He said nothing directly, but she caught the attention in his face when she mentioned Eleanor, the particular focusing that she had come to recognize as his version of interest. After the visit, while her father rested, she walked with Edmund to the entrance hall. "You seem well," he said, not as a social formula, as an observation. "I'm working on things," she said. "Yes," he said. He said it as though this explained everything, and in a way it did. She stood in the entrance hall after he left and looked at the marble floor where, months ago, she had dropped a silk ribbon without thinking about who would pick it up. She had been in this house her whole life. She had walked this hall 10,000 times. She had never once thought about the floor. She looked at it now. She went to find Mrs. Aldous. "The floor in the entrance hall," she said. "Who is responsible for maintaining it?" Mrs. Aldous looked at her. "That would be Daniel, my lady. He does the stonework throughout the lower floor." "How long has he worked here?" 11 years. Seraphine nodded. "Please tell him that the floor is in excellent condition, and that I've noticed." Mrs. Aldous's expression did something complicated. "I will, my lady," she said. Seraphine went back upstairs. She was aware, even as she did it, that this was a small thing, enormously small, in the context of everything that had gone before. But she was learning, slowly, through a process that was neither comfortable nor quick, that small things accumulated, that they had always accumulated, in both directions, and that she was only now choosing which direction she was going to accumulate in. She sat at her desk and looked at the letter from Eleanor that she had received that morning. Eleanor had written about her garden, which she maintained with considerable dedication. She had written about a neighbor whose children occasionally wandered through the fence, and who she had decided, after an initially irritated response, to simply enjoy. She had written about a book she was reading, that she thought Seraphine would find interesting. Seraphine read it twice. She picked up her pen. She wrote back about the book she had been reading since December, the one she had gone to retrieve from the reading room the afternoon Margaret had spoken in the corridor, without knowing who she was speaking to. She wrote about her father's improving condition, and about the charity she had started attending, a women's education organization whose work she had known about for years as an abstract good thing, and was now beginning to understand as a concrete, specific, demanding one. She had attended 3 meetings. She had said almost nothing in the first 2, which for her was extraordinary. She had listened to women who ran the organization, women who had been doing the unglamorous, relentless, underfunded work of it for years. And she had understood very quickly that her role here was not to lead. It was to show up. She was showing up. She wrote about this to Eleanor without exaggerating its virtue or minimizing its difficulty. She wrote that she had spent the first meeting feeling slightly absurd, as though she were a person wearing someone else's clothes, and that the second meeting had been less strange, and that by the third, she had found herself genuinely invested in a question about textbook funding that had nothing to do with her own life, and everything to do with the lives of people she had never previously thought much about. She wrote, "I am not sure if I am doing this correctly, but I think doing it incorrectly is still better than not doing it." She sealed the letter. She thought about Edmund's word, sufficient. She thought about how much of her life she had spent trying to achieve states that were more than sufficient, the most, the best, the most admired, the most powerful in a given room. She thought about how hollow most of those states had felt upon arrival, and how she had always concluded from that hollowness that the problem was with the amount rather than with the direction. She had wanted more, always more, and more had never filled the space. She was beginning to suspect the space had never needed filling. She was beginning to suspect the space was just what the inside of a person felt like when they were paying attention to the right things. She went to her father's room. He was awake, reading. The first sustained reading he had managed since the illness, which Edmund had said was a good sign. He looked up when she came in and lowered the book. "How are you?" he said. "Well," she said. And then, because she was practicing honesty, uncertain, working on things, he studied her. "Edmund says you've been attending meetings. The women's education group. He mentioned it?" "I asked him what you'd been doing with yourself." A pause. "I noticed you were out more." Seraphine sat in the chair beside the bed. "I'm trying to be useful." Her father looked at her for a long time. "You are useful," he said. "You've always been capable of it. He stopped. He looked at the window. "I made it too easy to choose the other way." Seraphine said nothing. "You're not angry with me," he said. It came out almost as a question. "No," she said. "I was, briefly. Then I understood it better." She looked at her hands. "I think you were doing what seemed like love, and I think it was love. It was just not the useful kind." Her father was quiet. "The useful kind is harder," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." They sat together in the January light, while the fire shifted in the grate, and the house went on around them with its ordinary sounds, Mrs. Aldous in the corridor, the distant clatter of something in the kitchen, the creak of the stairs. Seraphine thought about the charity meeting next Tuesday. She thought about Eleanor's letter, which she would post tomorrow. She thought about Daniel, who had maintained the marble floor for 11 years. Small things, accumulating. She thought about Edmund's clinic on Millbank Road, the waiting room with the children's drawings pinned on the wall, the sound of his voice through the partition speaking to people who had brought him their real problems and trusted him to meet them honestly. She thought about what it was to be trusted honestly. She wanted to be worth that. She was not there yet. But she was, day by day, becoming less far from it. That was sufficient. For now, it was more than sufficient. She wrote to Eleanor about the shoemaker and the tradespeople, not to be praised for it, but because she had found, in the past months, that writing to Eleanor helped her understand what she was actually doing and why. Eleanor had a way of asking questions that were not intrusive, but which opened up something Seraphine had not known she was ready to look at. Eleanor wrote back, asking whether the difficulty of the repair work had surprised her. Seraphine sat with this question for a day before she answered it. She wrote, "Yes. I expected it to be difficult in the way that difficult things are difficult, requiring effort and patience. What I did not expect was the particular quality of the difficulty. It is the difficulty of doing the right thing, and discovering that the right thing does not resolve anything." Clara Finch accepted my apology with 2 words, and complete courtesy, and complete distance, and I went away feeling not better, but more clearly positioned in relation to what I had done, which is perhaps more useful than feeling better. But it is harder. Eleanor wrote back. Yes. That is what repair actually is. Not a restoration of the original state, which is gone. Something different, that has to be built from the materials that remain. Seraphine read this letter several times. She thought about materials. She thought about what remained after 24 years of not seeing the people around her, of treating the world as a service that existed to accommodate her preferences, of believing that the deference of others was evidence of her own worth. The materials were not plentiful. The damage was real, and some of it was not reparable in the direct sense. Clara Finch was not going to become someone who trusted her. The housekeeper whose wages she had anonymously replaced might never know the replacement had happened. The families in the letters her father had sent could not unlive 6 years of diminished circumstances. She could not undo any of it. She could only do differently, going forward, and allow the forward motion to accumulate into something that was, eventually, a different kind of life. She was impatient with this, which was new in itself. She had never been impatient for slow, steady things before. She had been impatient for outcomes, for the world to arrive at the shape she had decided it should take, quickly and without difficulty. This was a different impatience, the impatience of someone who could see what they were trying to build and understood that building it was slow. Edmund had said something to her during one of his Thursday visits that she had held on to. He had been describing a patient who had made significant dietary changes to address a heart condition and who came in every 2 weeks frustrated that the changes were not producing faster results. Edmund had said, in the plain way he said things, that the body was not a machine that responded immediately to inputs, but a system that adjusted over time, and that the frustration was understandable, but the adjustment was happening even when it was not yet visible. She had understood, hearing this, that he was describing something beyond the patient's heart. She did not say so. She filed it away. She had developed, over the past months, a habit of filing things away rather than immediately responding to them, of sitting with new understandings instead of rushing to apply them. This was something she had watched Edmund do, in conversations and during visits, and had gradually begun to adopt. She had found it slowed her down in ways she had initially resisted and eventually come to rely on. She relied on it now when she wrote to Eleanor, and when she sat in the charity meetings, and when she went over the estate accounts and found new things that needed addressing. She sat with them. She thought about them carefully before she acted. She acted when she was certain, rather than when she was impatient. This was, she understood, a fundamental change in how she moved through the world. She had always acted from impatience before, from the certainty that her first assessment was correct, and that delay served no one. She had been right often enough that the certainty had seemed justified. She was learning that being right about the outcome did not necessarily mean she had understood the full situation, and that understanding the full situation, even when it slowed things down, produced better outcomes than speed alone. She had not expected Eleanor's visit to feel the way it felt when Eleanor's carriage came up the drive on a Thursday morning in late May, and Eleanor stepped out of it. Taller than Seraphine remembered, or perhaps that was just how she now carried herself, with the ease of someone who had made her own life and was at peace with it. They had been writing to each other for 5 months. The letters had been doing the work of rebuilding, and she had believed, from the letters, that she knew who Eleanor was now. She was finding that the person in the letters and the person standing in the drive were the same person, which was a relief, and that there was nonetheless something different about physical presence that letters could not account for. The particular quality of being in the same room as someone, the small adjustments of attention that happened automatically, the sense of someone as an embodied person rather than a voice on the page. She had expected it to be more awkward. It was not awkward. It was simply new, which was different. They walked in the garden in the morning, the May garden that was fully committed to itself now, and they talked about the correspondence, and about the things they had both been doing, and about Eleanor's neighbor with the wandering children, and about the administrative review, and about the education charity, and about her father's improving health. They talked with the directness and comfort of people who have already said the true things to each other and do not need to ease into them. At some point in the afternoon, sitting in the sitting room with tea, and the watercolor painting on the wall that Eleanor said was very good, Eleanor said, "You seem different." "I know," Seraphine said. "I don't mean in a surface way," Eleanor said. "I mean something underneath. You seem like someone who is actually here." Seraphine looked at the painting. I'm trying, she said. Eleanor looked at her with the particular directness of an old friend who has also become a new one. I think you're more than trying, Eleanor said. I think you're doing it. Seraphine held her teacup. She thought about what that meant, actually being present in her own life rather than managing the surface of it. She thought about how long it had taken. She thought about a chair in a library and the man who had not given it up. She thought about how much depended, sometimes, on one moment of someone simply telling the truth. The charity auction was held at a private hall near the river in February, when the city was cold and the light came low and thin through the tall windows. It was the kind of event Seraphine had attended 100 times in different forms. Well-dressed people gathered in a warm room to spend money on things they did not need for causes they genuinely supported, sometimes more than they meant to and sometimes less. There was food and a reasonable orchestra and a great deal of social navigation happening simultaneously on multiple levels, which Seraphine had once found entirely natural and now found both familiar and slightly more transparent than it used to be. She arrived alone. Not because she had no one to accompany her, but because she had found, over the past months, that arriving alone suited her better. It meant she could leave when she chose and go where she wanted, without the social gravity of a companion to manage. She had always moved through rooms like someone managing multiple tasks at once, her own position, her companion's comfort, the impression being made, the conversations being cultivated. Arriving alone removed several of those tasks and left her with the one that was actually interesting, the people in front of her. She checked in at the door, accepted a program from the young woman who handed them out, and thanked her. The young woman blinked, slightly startled. Seraphine noticed this and said nothing, but she tucked it away. She had been learning to notice when small courtesy surprised people, and what that said about what they expected from her. It was not comfortable, the noticing, but she had decided that discomfort was not a reason to stop. The room was half full when she arrived, filling steadily. She recognized people, acquaintances, contacts, faces from other events. She greeted several of them with a warmth that was not performed, which she suspected some of them found slightly disorienting, because her warmth had previously come with strings attached, and this did not. The charity organizing this auction was not the women's education group she had been attending, but a connected organization, one that worked on housing for working families in the city. She had learned about it through the education meetings and had done enough reading to understand its work before she came. She had also made a contribution before the event, anonymously, because she had learned from Eleanor, who had done charitable work for years and was direct about what it required, that showing up without having done the preparation was a particular kind of uselessness. She was in the middle of a conversation with a woman named Patricia Howell, who ran the housing charity, and who had the efficient, slightly worn look of someone who had been doing important work for a long time without sufficient resources, when it happened. It happened at the edge of the room, near the display of items to be auctioned. A young man, she recognized him distantly as the second son of a viscount. His name was Gerald something. She had met him twice and found him hollow both times. Was speaking to a woman who worked for the charity. The woman, whose name was Ruth, had been introduced to Seraphine 20 minutes earlier. Ruth was in her 30s, competent and direct, and had answered Seraphine's questions about the charity's methods with the straightforward seriousness of someone who appreciated being taken seriously. Gerald was not taking her seriously. He was not being crude. He was doing something more refined and more familiar to Seraphine. He was dismissing the particular manner of someone who believes they are doing someone a favor by speaking to them and wants that favor acknowledged. He was talking over Ruth's sentences and making a joke of something she had said, with the easy confidence of a man who had never been in a room where he wasn't listened to. Ruth's expression had gone careful and controlled, the expression Seraphine recognized from Mrs. Aldous, from Clara, from dozens of household staff over the years. The expression of a person managing someone with more social power than sense. Seraphine walked over. She did not hurry. She did not make it a performance. She simply crossed the room and arrived at the conversation and said, in a clear, pleasant voice, "Ruth, I'm sorry to interrupt." Patricia had a question she wanted you for. I can walk you over if this is a good moment. Ruth looked at her. Something in her face eased. Of course, Ruth said. Excuse me. She said this to Gerald with perfect courtesy, and moved with Seraphine toward the center of the room. They were 3 steps away before Ruth said, quietly, "Thank you." "Patricia doesn't actually have a question," Seraphine said. "I gathered," Ruth said, "but I appreciate the exit." Seraphine introduced her to Patricia anyway, which meant the lie became a conversation, which was tidier. She stepped back and let the 2 women talk, and found a spot to stand where she could see the room without being in the middle of it. She was aware, from a peripheral part of her attention, that Edmund was somewhere in the room. She had not known he would be here. She registered him about 10 minutes later, talking near the window with a man she recognized from the hospital foundation committee. Edmund was wearing his usual well-made, slightly unfashionable jacket, and was listening to the man with the particular quality of attention she had come to associate with him. Engaged, unhurried, fully present. He saw her at the same moment she was looking at him. He gave a small nod. She returned it. She did not go over immediately. She was not performing restraint. She simply had other conversations to be in, and did not feel the old compulsion to position herself in relation to him, as though he were a problem to be solved. He was not a problem. He was a person she respected, and the evening was not about him. She spent the next 40 minutes doing the actual work of the event, speaking with 2 donors about the housing charity's current project, asking Ruth practical questions about the construction timeline for the new building, and bidding on 3 items in the auction, with a deliberately unfussy efficiency that made the auctioneer visibly relax. She won a watercolor painting of the river that she genuinely liked and would hang in the sitting room. At the end of the formal portion of the evening, when people were moving into smaller conversations and the orchestra was playing something lighter, Edmund appeared beside her. "Congratulations on the painting," he said. "Thank you," she said. "The light in it is very good." He looked at it. "It is." They stood side by side for a moment, looking at the painting, which was propped against the wall with its auction tag still attached. "I saw what you did," he said, "earlier, with the woman from the charity." "Ruth," she said. "Yes." A pause. "Well done." She looked at the painting. "I had a very good example." He looked at her briefly, with that careful attention. "I don't think you did it because of an example," he said. "I think you did it because it was the right thing." She considered this. "Both can be true," she said. "Both can be true," he agreed. The orchestra shifted into something slower. Around them, the room had taken on the warmer, quieter texture of an evening winding down, people finishing their wine, conversations becoming more personal, the particular ease that comes after the formal part of the night is over. "My father is doing well," she said. "He walked in the garden last week for the first time." "I know," Edmund said. "I saw him Thursday. He mentioned you let him choose the time of the walk himself. He needed to feel capable of that decision," Edmund said. She had thought about this, after her father told her. She had thought about the difference between managing someone and trusting them, between the version of care that kept people dependent and the version that moved them toward independence. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said, months ago, that you can't make someone follow guidance. You can only support it." He waited. "I've been applying it to other things," she said, "not just my father." "How is that going?" he said. She thought about Clara's 2 careful words, about Eleanor's letter with the slanted, energetic handwriting, about Ruth's expression easing when Seraphine crossed the room, about Daniel and the marble floor, about the charity meetings and the women who did the unglamorous work year after year, and who had let her sit in the room with them and listen. "Slowly," she said, "imperfectly, better than it was." He nodded once. "That's usually how it goes," he said. They stood in companionable quiet for a moment, not the quiet of 2 people who have nothing to say to each other, but the quiet of 2 people who have said the true things and are comfortable with what remains. "You never did apologize," she said. "It came out as a simple observation, not a grievance." "No," he said, "I didn't." "I'm glad," she said. "If you had, I might not have looked for what I was actually looking for." He looked at her. "And what was that?" he said. She thought about it. She thought about the question she had carried from that first night in the library, the one that had asked, Why did that bother you so much? She thought about what it had been pointing at all along, not the chair, not the social slight, not even the novelty of being refused, something else. Something that had to do with the difference between being surrounded and being seen, between being deferred to and being met as a person who could handle the truth. Someone who would tell me the truth, she said, and believe I could stand to hear it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You can." 2 words, said simply, without performance, without the particular weight of someone saying something they believe is a revelation, said the way Edmund said most true things, as though they were just facts, which they were. She looked at him. "I know," she said. And she did. She looked around the room, at Ruth, talking with Patricia, at the painting she had won leaning against the wall, at the people moving through the last hour of the evening, with the ordinary warmth of human beings, at the end of a winter night. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, standing at the center of every room she entered and understanding none of them. She thought about what it had cost, all the people who had smiled and given ground and said yes when they meant no, because no one had ever shown them that a different kind of exchange was possible. She thought about Margaret in the corridor. Kind underneath it, I always thought. Somewhere there's a good heart. She hoped that was true. She was trying to make it true, which was perhaps the best she could do. She was no longer the most important person in the room. She was not trying to be. She was simply a person at a charity auction who had arrived with enough preparation to be useful, who had done one small direct thing when another person needed it, and who was standing by a painting she genuinely liked at the end of an evening that had gone, on balance, rather well. The orchestra played. The winter pressed against the tall windows. The room went on around her, warm and ongoing, full of people with lives of their own. She stood in it, without needing to rearrange it. And for the first time, that was enough. More than enough. It was, she thought, exactly what she had always been reaching for. She simply had not known where to look. She knew now. She stayed until the end of the evening. Not because she had to. Because she wanted to. She had not told her father the full content of the letter she had found in the accounts folder until she had had time to think carefully about what to do with it. This was also new, the habit of thinking before speaking, of considering not just what was true, but what needed to be said, and when, and how, and to whom. She had always spoken when she had something to say, confident that her timing was correct, because her timing had always served her own purposes, which were the only purposes she had previously considered. She was considering more purposes now. The letter named a family she knew, not well but recognizably, a family that had been at the edges of the same social world she moved through for years. She had not thought about them specifically. She had not thought about any of the people in her father's letters specifically, because none of them had been in the center of her attention, which was the only place she had ever directed her care. She thought about them now. She thought about a version of herself at 17, at 19, at 22, moving through social events with the particular confidence of someone who had never felt the ground shift under them. And she thought about the people who had moved around her at those events, with the careful awareness that saying the wrong thing, or sitting in the wrong chair, or failing to accommodate the Duke's daughter in the right way, carried consequences they could not afford. She had not known. This, she had been discovering, was one of the most difficult parts of the whole reckoning. Not the knowing, but the not knowing. If she had known, she might have stopped it. She might have been the kind of person who would have stopped it, but she had not known, because the architecture of her life had been designed to ensure she did not know, and she had never questioned the architecture. She was questioning it now, thoroughly and without mercy. She sat in the study one evening, after her father had gone to bed, and she went back through the letter and the 2 others she had found, and she wrote down, in her notebook, exactly what she understood to have happened in each case. She wrote it plainly and specifically, without softening. This was a practice she had developed recently, the practice of naming things accurately, which was different from naming them dramatically. Dramatic naming was a form of performance. Accurate naming was a form of understanding. She wrote down what had been done. She wrote down who had been affected and how. She wrote down what could not be undone, and what might, with care and the right approach, be partially addressed. She put the notebook down and looked at the fire. She thought about what Edmund had said to her on one of his first visits, You can support it, but it has to come from him. She thought about how that principle extended beyond medical guidance. You could not make people better simply by deciding they should be. You could create the conditions in which they could become better. You could remove obstacles. You could offer what you had to offer, honestly and without expectation. You could support things. She would support the things that could be supported. She would let the rest be what it was. The past, permanent and irreversible, which was not nothing, but was also not a place to live. She put the notebook away and went to bed. In the morning, she was up before the household, and she sat at the desk in the sitting room, and she began the work of figuring out, carefully and practically, what the conditions for support looked like in each of the 3 situations she had identified. This took most of the morning. It required thinking about people she had never thought about specifically, imagining their circumstances with the particular effort of someone who is teaching themselves to imagine other people's circumstances for the first time. It was imperfect. She did not know enough. She would have to make some assumptions, and she would be wrong about some of them, and she would address the wrongness when it became apparent. She worked until noon. Then she went to have lunch with her father, who was improving daily, and who had begun to ask her, in the tentative way of someone not sure they were allowed to ask, what she was spending her time on. She told him the truth. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is there anything I can do?" She looked at him. "I'll let you know," she said, "when I find something that is yours to do." He nodded. They ate their lunch in the mild winter light, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, and the silence between them was the cleanest it had ever been. She thought often, during those weeks, about the particular quality of Edmund's attention. She had been in the presence of many people who were considered intelligent, and she had learned to recognize the different varieties of intelligence, the quick kind that solved things fast, the verbal kind that found the right words before anyone else, the strategic kind that saw several moves ahead in any social situation. These were all things she had encountered and recognized. What Edmund had was different. It was a quality she did not have a precise word for. The closest she could get was, he was interested in what was actually there. Not what he expected to find, not what he was looking for, not what would be most convenient, or most impressive, or most narratively satisfying. He was interested in the thing itself. She had found this quality disorienting when she first encountered it, because it meant she could not predict how he would respond to anything she did. Her entire social life had been conducted on the basis of predictability. She knew what she wanted. She knew what other people needed in order to give it to her, and she arranged things accordingly. Edmund was not arrangeable. He simply responded to what was actually in front of him. She was trying to become someone who did the same. It was, she had found, both harder and more interesting than anything she had previously attempted. The interest surprised her. She had expected the process of changing to be mostly effortful and mostly unpleasant, the kind of thing you did because it was right, and not because it was engaging. She was finding that it was engaging, that paying genuine attention to other people was, in fact, more interesting than managing their behavior, because people who were seen clearly were more complex and more surprising than people who were managed into predictable responses. Dorothy Crane was a good example of this. She had expected Dorothy to be defensive and inflexible, and to require careful handling. What she found, when she paid attention rather than managing, was someone who was enormously competent and genuinely thoughtful about the organization's work, and willing to be direct about its limitations in a way that was actually useful. Dorothy did not trust her yet. That was fine. Trust was earned over time by showing up consistently, and she would show up consistently. She wrote this in her notebook in the evening, and then read it back and thought, 6 months ago, I would not have written that. 6 months ago, I would have expected trust to follow from my name and my position, and the effort of a single well-conducted conversation. I would not have understood that it was something built from repeated evidence over time. She had not understood many things 6 months ago that she understood now. She thought about Edmund's word for this kind of understanding, applied in a different context, adjustment. He had said her father's body was adjusting, even when the adjustment was not yet visible. She thought this might be true of people as well. That change happened in layers, the visible parts coming only after the deeper changes had already occurred, and that impatience for the visible signs was a misunderstanding of how the process actually worked. She was more patient than she had been, She was still learning to be patient. She was, she thought, approximately where she should be. The spring came slowly, the way spring always comes to cities that have had a hard winter. Not in a single arrival, but in a series of small advances and retreats. A mild day followed by a cold one, the trees putting out hesitant buds that pulled back at the next frost before trying again. By mid-March, the garden at Hartwell Manor was beginning to show the first real signs of the season. A line of early crocuses along the south-facing border, the bare branches of the hornbeam at the corner of the lawn showing the faintest green at their tips when the light caught them at the right angle. George Hartwell walked in his garden for the first time since October. He walked slowly, and with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned, over the winter, that his body was something to be attended to rather than ignored, and he walked with Seraphine beside him, who had also learned something over the winter, and who now walked beside her father, in the easy silence of two people who had finally started telling each other the truth. Edmund had cleared the outdoor walking 3 weeks earlier. He had been specific about it, not too long, not too fast, not on days when the cold was still sharp enough to tax the lungs unnecessarily. Her father had listened, with the careful attention he now brought to Edmund's instructions, which was different from the attention he had once brought to everything, less assertive, more genuinely open to the possibility that someone else might know something he did not. This, Seraphine thought, watching him pick his way carefully along the gravel path, was one of the stranger gifts the winter had given them both. "The hornbeam is going to need attention this year," her father said, looking at the tree. "I know," Seraphine said. "I've already spoken to the gardener about it." He looked at her briefly. This was something else that was new, the way she now spoke about the household as someone who had taken hold of it, not as someone who had always stood at its center, having things done around her. She had taken hold of it in October, out of necessity, when he could not manage it, and she had not put it back down afterward, because she had discovered that managing it was something she was good at, and that being good at something, when the something was real, produced a particular kind of satisfaction she had not previously encountered. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes," she said. They walked to the end of the path and turned back toward the house. The air was cold, but not biting. The sky above the garden was a pale, thin blue that had the quality of early spring light, not quite convinced of itself yet. "Edmund came on Thursday," she said, "when you were resting. I spoke with him briefly. He said the numbers were good." "They are good," she said, "better than he expected for this point in the recovery." She paused. "He wants you to consider reducing the rate of the medication gradually over the next 2 months, if you continue to improve." Her father nodded slowly. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I want to go back to Westminster in April." Seraphine looked at him. "It might be too soon," she said. "Edmund said it was worth considering." "Edmund said it was worth discussing," she corrected, which is different from saying it was advisable. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "When did you start listening so carefully to the precise words of what people said?" "Since I started noticing how much precision matters," she said. They walked in silence for a few steps. "The foundation wants me to chair a committee," he said, "in June. I told them I would think about it." "That seems reasonable," she said. "June gives you 3 months." He looked at the hornbeam. "I feel well," he said. "Better than I expected to feel by now." "I know you do," she said. "Edmund says that's partly the changes you've made, and partly you. He thinks you have a good constitution." She paused. "He didn't say it in those words exactly. He said your body responds well to proper care when it receives it, which I understood to mean that you were not as fragile as October suggested, provided you continued with the current plan." Her father considered this. "He communicates carefully." "He does," she agreed. They reached the end of the garden path and stopped at the bench near the wall where the sun came in strongest in the morning. Her father sat down on it, not because he was tired, but because the bench was there, and the sun was pleasant. Seraphine sat beside him. "I've been thinking," her father said, "about the letter you found in January." She waited. "The family's concerned," he said. "I've been trying to think about what could be done." He looked at his hands. "There isn't much that can be undone. The business with the Prentice family, that was 6 years ago. I don't know that reaching back that far accomplishes anything for them now." "Probably not," she said. "But there's a son in that family, I believe, who was trying to establish himself in a connected trade. A quiet introduction, from the right name, would not undo anything. But it might help. He looked at her. You've already looked into it. I have some time, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You're managing all of this, he said. The household, the accounts, the charity work, the things I should have been doing. You were ill, she said. Before the illness, he said. She looked at the garden. A robin had settled on the low wall across the path. It sat with the particular composed stillness of a bird that has decided somewhere is safe and is not going to rush. You were doing what you thought was right, she said, and some of it was. The foundation work was real. The estate runs well. You built things that matter. She paused. And some of it needed to stop. And it has stopped. That seems like enough to work from. He was quiet for a long moment. I spoke with Hartley, he said. When Edmund told him he was stepping back from primary oversight, Hartley was dignified about it, which was more than I deserved to ask of him. Hartley has always been dignified, Seraphine said. That is probably why we trusted him past the point where trust was warranted. Her father looked at her with an expression she was becoming more familiar with, the expression of a man seeing his daughter clearly for the first time, and finding, underneath all the years of careful management and indulgence and fear, someone he had not quite known was there. I'm proud of you, he said. He said it simply, without ceremony. She looked at the robin, which had not moved. Thank you, she said. She meant it. She received it without deflecting, and without the performance of pleasure, and without the hunger she had always felt when she received his approval, the hunger that always needed more because it came from a place that had never quite been filled. It did not feel like that now. It felt like something appropriate, a true thing said at the right moment, received by someone who did not need it to be anything more than what it was. I should go in, he said. Edmund said not too long. He did, she agreed. She stood and offered her arm. He took it, and they walked back toward the house through the early spring garden, and she thought about the conversation she needed to have with Francis Page next week about the outreach program, and the letter she needed to write to Eleanor about the watercolor painting she had won at the auction, and had finally hung in the sitting room, and the question she had been turning over for the past 2 weeks, about whether she was ready to take on more at the charity, or whether she needed another month before she was sure. She thought about Edmund's word, still, sufficient. She thought she was arriving at an understanding of it that went deeper than she had reached in the autumn. Sufficient was not a small word. It was not a consolation word. The word you used when you couldn't have more. It was a word for someone who had decided, after honest examination, that this, exactly this life, with its real work, and its genuine connections, and its imperfect, ongoing repairs, was actually enough. Not because there was nothing else, because this was real. And real was what she had been looking for all along, without knowing that was the name of what she wanted. She helped her father up the steps and into the house and handed him off to Mrs. Aldous, who was waiting with the particular composure of someone who had been watching the window and who had not been waiting at all. She went upstairs to her desk. She opened the notebook she had started keeping in January. Not a formal journal, nothing written for anyone else's eyes, just a place to record the shape of things as she understood them, which changed as she understood them better. She had found that writing things down helped her see them. She wrote, "He said he was proud of me, and I received it simply, and that was enough." Then she opened the letters that needed answering. She had a great deal to do. She was glad of it. The visit with the first of the 3 location managers happened on a Wednesday morning in a building near the south side of the city, in a room that smelled of old paper and chalk, and the particular institutional warmth of a space that had been occupied continuously for many years. The manager's name was Dorothy Crane. She was in her late 40s, and she had run this location of the charity for 8 years, which meant she had run it before Francis Page had expanded the organization to include it, which meant she had her own way of doing things, and her own reasons for those ways, and a healthy and entirely justified suspicion of people who arrived from outside with plans for improvement. Seraphine arrived 7 minutes early, which she had decided was the right interval, early enough to indicate that she took the meeting seriously, not so early as to create inconvenience. She brought a copy of the documents Francis Page had given her, which she had read thoroughly, and she brought her notebook, which she had learned was a better signal of attentiveness than a blank expression. Dorothy Crane came out to meet her with the evaluating efficiency of someone who had better things to do, and was prepared to give this a fair chance if it turned out to deserve one. She said, "You must be Seraphine Hartwell." "Yes," Seraphine said. "Thank you for seeing me." "Francis says you want to understand how we operate," Dorothy said. "I want to understand the gaps between how the three locations operate," Seraphine said. "Not to judge them, but to help standardize them where it makes sense. I understand this location has been running longer than the others, and that what works here may be worth applying more broadly." Dorothy looked at her. "Francis said you were direct," she said. "I try to be," Seraphine said. "Is that useful?" "Usually," Dorothy said. "Come in." They sat at a table stacked with folders and ledgers, and the ordinary evidence of a busy organization, and Dorothy walked her through the administrative system she had built over 8 years, with the particular combination of pride and practical frustration of someone who has made something work under difficult conditions and knows its limitations, because she built those limitations in herself, out of necessity. Seraphine listened. She asked questions that were specific and came from having read the documents. She did not take the questions in a direction that implied the current system was wrong. She took them in the direction of understanding why it had been built the way it had been built, which was different, and which produced different answers. By the end of the morning, Dorothy had shown her 3 things that did not appear in any of the official documents, and that were central to how the location actually functioned. Seraphine wrote them down carefully, and said she would need to understand whether the other locations had equivalent undocumented processes before she could make any recommendations. "That is the right approach," Dorothy said, in the tone of someone who had expected the wrong approach and was revising their assessment. Seraphine walked home from the meeting and thought about what she had learned, which was considerably more than she had expected to learn from a single conversation. She thought about how much knowledge was held in undocumented form by the people who did the actual work, knowledge that existed nowhere in any official record, but that was essential to the system functioning. She thought about how much she had not known about her own household for the same reason, because she had never asked. She had been asking, lately. She was finding it to be the most useful thing she did. The spring was fully established now, the city warm enough in the afternoons that the windows in the charity hall were left open during the meetings, and the smell of it, something green and particular, the smell of a season committing itself, came in with the sounds of the street below. Seraphine was presenting her preliminary findings from the first 2 locations to Francis Page and Dorothy Crane, and the manager of the second location, a woman named Alice Vane, who was younger than Dorothy and had been running her location for 3 years, and had the sharp, organized intelligence of someone who had learned to do a great deal with very little. She had been preparing this presentation for 2 weeks. She had prepared presentations before. She had stood in front of committees and charitable boards and groups of people with significant social power and had presented things. But those presentations had always been performances, carefully constructed for the effect they would produce, measured for what they would convey about her rather than about the subject. She had always known, with some certainty, that her name and her manner would carry a great deal of the weight, and she had used that knowledge. She used it now as well, but differently. Her name and her manner meant people listened when she began. What she said after they began listening was what determined whether they kept listening, and she had put the past 2 weeks into making sure what she said was worth keeping listening to. She presented the findings in the order that made the most logical sense, starting with what the 2 locations had in common, rather than where they differed, because that order made the differences easier to understand when they arrived. She was specific, and she cited the exact source of every figure she gave. When she was uncertain about something, she said she was uncertain about it, and said what she needed to find out before she could be confident. Dorothy asked 3 questions. Alice Vane asked 2. Francis Page asked 1, which was the most precise of all of them, and which took Seraphine 5 minutes to fully answer. She answered it fully. Francis Page said, "The 3rd location review starts next week?" "Monday," Seraphine said. "Good," Francis Page said. "This is useful work." She said it in the same plain tone she used for everything, without any particular warmth attached to it, and Seraphine received it in that spirit, as an accurate assessment by someone whose assessments she had come to trust, precisely because they were not inflated for social effect. She thanked her and gathered her papers. On the way out, Dorothy caught up with her in the corridor. "You're different from what I expected," Dorothy said. "I know," Seraphine said. "I was different from what I expected too." Dorothy looked at her for a moment. "The work you did at my location was genuinely useful," she said. "The undocumented processes you identified. I'd been trying to get someone to pay attention to those for 3 years. Nobody wanted to look at the systems that weren't officially breaking. The systems that are quietly not working are usually more important than the ones that are visibly broken," Seraphine said. "Because the quietly broken ones don't get fixed." Dorothy said, "Exactly." And then she turned and went back down the corridor, because she had other things to do. Seraphine walked out of the building and into the spring afternoon. She was, she thought, doing real work. Work that was helping people she would never meet, girls who would get access to educational resources because the administrative system that delivered those resources was functioning correctly. She would not know their names. She would not meet them. She would not be thanked by them. This did not diminish the work. If anything, it clarified it. She walked home through the spring afternoon and thought about all the work that was done this way, quietly, structurally, by people whose names never appeared on anything that was celebrated, but without which nothing that was celebrated could function. She was becoming one of those people. She had never expected to find that more satisfying than what she had been before. She had not expected it. But here it was. The conversation with Frances Page happened on a Tuesday in late March, in the same plain room where the charity held its fortnightly meetings, and it lasted for an hour and a quarter, which was twice as long as Seraphine had expected. Frances Page was a woman of 57 who had started the education charity with 2 colleagues and a rented desk 22 years ago, and had grown it, through the kind of methodical, persistent, unbeautiful work that does not produce dramatic stories, into an organization that operated 3 locations and had helped more than 400 girls obtain educational qualifications they would not otherwise have had access to. She spoke about the work plainly and without sentiment, which Seraphine had come to appreciate very much. Sentiment was fine in its place, but it made a poor substitute for the specific. Frances said, at the beginning of the conversation, "I want to understand what you're looking for." Seraphine said, "I want to be useful. I want to do work that matters, and do it well. I don't want to be a patron. I don't want the organization to be shaped around what my name provides. I want to do the thing that most needs doing, whatever that is." Frances studied her. "The thing that most needs doing," she said, "is a review of our administrative structure. We've grown faster than our systems have kept up with. We have 3 locations that are each running their own versions of the same processes, with variations that are causing inefficiency and occasional real gaps in record-keeping. We need someone to go through all 3, understand what is actually happening against what should be happening, and produce a plan for standardizing it. It's approximately 3 months of work. It requires careful reading, a methodical mind, and the willingness to tell people honestly what you have found, even when what you have found is that they have been doing something wrong." Seraphine said, "I can do that." Frances looked at her for another long moment. "I believe you can," she said. "I also want to say something directly." "Please do," Seraphine said. "Some of the women who run those locations have been doing this work for many years and will not immediately trust someone who comes in to review them, regardless of the reason or the credentials. Some of them will be defensive. Some of them will be patient but guarded. You will need to earn their trust, and the way to earn it is to make clear, through how you work rather than through what you say, that you are there to help them and not to catch them out." Seraphine said, "I understand. Do you?" Frances said, not unkindly, with the direct curiosity of someone who asked questions because they wanted actual answers. "I do," Seraphine said. "I have spent the past several months learning the difference between being in a room and being useful in a room. I am still learning it, but I understand the principle, and I understand that it requires patience, and I am prepared for the work to take longer and be less straightforward than the task itself suggests." Frances Page looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something in the notebook open on the table in front of her. "I'll introduce you to the location managers next week," she said. "We'll start from there." Seraphine went home and sat at her desk and wrote to Eleanor. She wrote the way she had learned to write to Eleanor over the past several months, without managing the impression she was producing. without editing toward the version of herself she wanted Eleanor to see. She wrote what had actually happened, and what she had actually felt, and what she was actually uncertain about, which included several things. She was uncertain about whether she would be good at the administrative review, or whether she would discover, partway through, that she had overestimated her own capacity for the specific kind of careful, sustained attention the work required. She was uncertain about whether the location managers would trust her, or whether they would do the thing that she herself had done for years, produce the surface of engagement, while withholding the actual engagement, until they felt safe enough to offer it. She was uncertain about whether 3 months of this work would change her, or whether she would begin it as one person, and emerge from it much the same. She was not uncertain about wanting to do it. That was new. That specific certainty, rooted not in her history of getting what she wanted, but in something quieter and more reliable. The recognition that she had identified something real, that she could actually do, and that needed doing. That was new, and she was learning to trust it. Eleanor wrote back 4 days later, which was faster than usual. She wrote that she was glad. She wrote that the uncertainty was appropriate, that walking into something you were not certain about was how most worthwhile things started. She wrote that she was looking forward to hearing how it went. She also wrote something that Seraphine read twice and then sat with. She wrote, "I have been thinking about you often this winter. Not the person from before. The person I have been corresponding with since autumn. I want you to know that the person you have been becoming is someone I would have wanted as a friend, even if we had not started as friends first. That matters to me to say." Seraphine set the letter down on the desk. She looked at the watercolor of the river on the wall, which she had hung in the east-facing window that caught the morning light, and which looked, in that light, better than she had expected. The river in it had a particular quality, gray and moving and very real. She wrote back to Eleanor that afternoon. She wrote, "I have been thinking about a version of something you said in your second letter to me. You said friendship was built on new ground when it was rebuilt. I have been thinking about what the ground is made of now, and I think it is honesty, and I think I have been lucky to find out, even late, that this is the most solid kind." She wrote, "Thank you for telling me that. It matters to receive it simply." Edmund came on a Thursday in early April, for what proved to be the last of the regular weekly visits. Her father's progress had been strong and consistent, and Edmund had been reducing the frequency of his visits over the past month. He arrived at the house, examined her father, reviewed the numbers that had been recorded carefully since the last visit, and said that he thought monthly visits would be sufficient from this point. Her father said, "Is that a good sign?" "Yes," Edmund said. "It's a very good sign." Her father looked at Seraphine, who was standing in the doorway of the bedroom. "Then I'll accept it," he said. After the visit, Edmund put on his coat in the entrance hall, and Seraphine walked with him to the door. The April day outside was mild, and the garden beyond the entrance was fully in its early season now. The crocuses finished, the early daffodils at their height along the south border. "How is the charity work going?" he said. "I'm starting the administrative review next week," she said. 3 months. He nodded. "It suits you," he said. "That kind of work." She looked at the garden. "I think it does," she said. "I'm finding that many things suit me that I didn't know I was capable of, which suggests I should have been doing them for a long time." "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps you needed to arrive at them when you could actually use them." She looked at him. He said things like this occasionally, things that were not consolation and not judgment, but simply the accurate assessment of the situation, and each time she found herself, briefly, slightly startled by them. "You don't often say things to make people feel better about the time they've wasted," she said. "No," he said, "but I don't think time spent arriving somewhere is wasted time, necessarily. It depends on what you do with where you end up." She thought about that. "I intend to do a great deal with where I've ended up," she said. "I know," he said. They stood for a moment in the mild April air at the door of the house. Behind him, the garden was going about the business of spring, the particular quality of industry that early spring has, everything moving and nothing finished yet, the whole season in the process of becoming. She had stood on this step 10,000 times in her life, looking out at this garden, and she had never paid attention to it the way she did now. She was discovering that the world had more in it when she was not primarily concerned with what it was giving her. "Edmund," she said. He looked at her. "I want to thank you," she said, "not for the autumn, not for refusing me a chair, which I understand you never gave another thought to." "Truthfully, no," he said. "Not even for my father's care, though that matters more than I know how to say." He waited. "For being exactly what you are," she said. "For just being that, in front of me, consistently, until I understood what it meant." He looked at her with the expression she had come to know best from him, the quiet, honest attention that he brought to everything he considered worth considering. "You did the work," he said. "Being myself is not a contribution to your character." "It is, though," she said. "It was. A specific and necessary one." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're going to do well, Lady Seraphine." She considered this. "Seraphine," she said, "please." He smiled, just slightly, but entirely. "Seraphine," he said. He walked out into the April morning. She stood in the doorway and watched him go down the front path and out through the gate and into the street, and she stood there for a little while after he was gone, not because she was watching him, but because the morning was good, and the garden was good, and there was no particular reason to go in yet. She was no longer the most important person in any room. She had stopped trying to be. She had started trying to be the most useful person in a room, which was harder, and produced something she was only beginning to understand how to describe. Not happiness, as she had once imagined it, a state that arrived when everything was arranged correctly around her. Not the satisfaction of a social position maintained and confirmed. Not the particular relief of getting what she wanted and knowing she would continue to get it. Something more durable than any of those things. Something that did not depend on what the world gave her, but on what she brought to it. She had spent 24 years in a house full of people who gave her everything she wanted, without ever asking whether any of it was actually good for her. She had spent 24 years believing that the world's deference was evidence of her own worth. She had spent 24 years confusing accommodation with love. One man, in a library, had simply not moved from his chair. It had taken her 6 months to understand what that meant, and to begin the slow, imperfect, unglamorous work of becoming someone who did not need the world to rearrange itself to make room for her. She was not finished. She was not sure she would ever be finished. She was not sure finishing was the point. She was certain, standing in the April doorway of her father's house, looking out at the garden coming into its season, that she was doing the right thing, that the work she had chosen, the administrative review, the charity meetings, the careful and ongoing repair of what she had broken over 24 years of not seeing other people, was real work, and that real work was what she had been looking for without knowing it. She had letters to write. She had the outreach program documents to read before next week. She had a conversation to plan with the first of the 3 location managers, and she needed to think carefully about how to approach it, not as someone arriving with authority, but as someone arriving with attention. She went upstairs to her desk. She opened the notebook. She wrote, "The garden is in full early spring. My father walked without help this morning. I begin the review next week." She sat for a moment. Then she wrote one more thing. She wrote, "I am, I think, the person I was supposed to become. I arrived late. I arrived by an unusual route. But I am here now." She closed the notebook. She opened the first of the documents. She began to read. Outside the window, the April morning went on around her, full and ordinary and real, and she was, for the first time in her life, exactly where she had chosen to be, doing exactly what she had chosen to do, and it was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was, she understood now, everything. She walked home from Edmund's farewell Thursday visit through the April morning with the kind of unhurried attention she had been developing over the past months, the habit of being in the place she was, rather than always preparing for the next place. The city was going about its business around her. Ordinary traffic, ordinary sounds, the particular quality of a spring morning that has decided the season is finally committed to itself. She walked past a flower seller near the corner of the main street and stopped to look at the early season flowers, yellow and white and a pale purple that was not quite lavender, and she bought a small bunch for no reason, except that they were there and she liked them. She had never done that before. Bought flowers without a reason. Flowers in her life had always been occasion flowers, flowers for events, for appearances, for the particular performance of a table laid correctly or a room presented correctly. She had not bought flowers simply because she passed them and found them pleasant. She carried them home and put them in a glass on the windowsill of the sitting room, near the watercolor painting, and they improved both the room and the morning, which was sufficient reason to have bought them. She sat at her desk. She thought about the administrative review, which was going well in the sense that she was learning a great deal, and difficult in the sense that what she was learning required her to restructure her understanding of several things she had thought she understood. Dorothy Crane had told her, at the third visit, that she was better at listening than she had expected. Seraphine had thanked her, and meant it, and had gone home, and written in her notebook, "Someone said I was better at listening than they expected. I am trying to be better at it than I expect." She thought about Eleanor, who was coming to visit in May, the first visit since before the autumn ball that had started everything. Eleanor had suggested it in her last letter, tentatively, and Seraphine had said yes immediately, and then had spent a week being slightly afraid of it, which was appropriate, and had eventually arrived at looking forward to it, which was better. She thought about her father, who was going to Westminster in April for a short session, and who had agreed to come home early on the first day, if he felt it was too much, which was the kind of agreement he would not have made a year ago, because he would not have admitted the possibility that something might be too much. He was learning things too, later, and in a different direction, but learning. She thought about Margaret, whose linen storage had been moved to the lower corridor in December, and who had been, since then, a slightly different presence in the household. Not warmer exactly. That was not the kind of person Margaret was, but less braced, less waiting. She had stopped holding things slightly away from Seraphine when she handed them to her, which was a small physical thing that Seraphine had noticed only after it stopped happening. She thought about the charity meetings, and the outreach program, and Caroline Hatch, who had joined the organization in February, and who had, as Seraphine had suspected, turned out to be very good at the administrative work. She thought about Ruth, who had sent her a brief note after the charity auction, thanking her for the intervention with Gerald, and who had written, at the bottom of the note, simply, "It's good to have an ally." Seraphine had read that 3 times. An ally. Not a patron, not a benefactress, not a powerful name to be managed carefully. An ally. She was becoming someone who could be called that. She was still becoming her. She was not finished. She was not certain that finishing was the point. She thought the point might be something more like the ongoing quality of the effort, not what you had become, but what you were continuing to become, the commitment to the process rather than the arrival at a destination. She opened the notebook. She wrote the date at the top of the page. Then she sat for a moment with the pen in her hand, looking at the flowers on the windowsill, and the watercolor painting, and the April light coming through the glass. She wrote, "I think the most important thing I have learned this year is the difference between wanting to be seen and wanting to see. I spent 24 years wanting to be seen, by which I meant wanting the world to reflect back to me the image I had decided I was. I received this reflection consistently, and it was not enough, and I did not know why it was not enough." She paused. "It was not enough because it was a mirror," she wrote. "A mirror only shows you what you bring to it. A person is something different. A person looks back at you with their own eyes, and sees their own things, and has their own understanding. And if you are paying attention, that is far more interesting, and far more useful than any reflection has ever been." She looked at what she had written. Then she closed the notebook. She had work to do. She had letters to write, and documents to read, and preparations to make for the week ahead, and she was glad of it, and she did the work that was in front of her, with the particular quality of attention she had been practicing for months. Not perfect, not always effortless, but genuine. Rooted in what was actually there, rather than what she had decided she wanted to find. The April morning went on around her, full of ordinary things. She was, for the first time in her life, paying full attention to all of them. And they were, every one, enough.